Good evening. I call this Sammamish Planning Commission meeting for January 19th, 2023 to order. Let's do roll call. Mike Briscoe.
I'm here.
John Bachman.
Here.
Carrie Bosworth.
Here.
Josh Amato.
Here.
I am Mark Boffman. Jerry Norman is not with us. And how about TC Labby? And TC, if you happen to be on the meeting and just haven't gotten elevated yet, why send a text or something. Okay, next let's read the meeting accessibility statement.
The public is welcome to attend Planning Commission meetings in person at City Hall, 801 228th Avenue Southeast, or virtually through Zoom. In accordance with latest public health guidance, masks are recommended but not required for in-person attendance. Public comments. Each speaker is allowed up to 3 minutes for non-agenda comment, 5 minutes if representing an organization, and 7 minutes for agenda public comment. For those providing comment through Zoom, once you have dialed into the meeting, please virtually raise your hand to indicate you would like to provide public comment. Your mic will remain muted until you are called on during the public comment period. To give public comment via Zoom, join the webinar via the link https://web.zoom.us06web/J//828-226-48794. To give public comment via mobile or landline telephone, dial the following number: US +1 253 215 8782, webinar ID 828-226-48794#.
Thank you, Julian. Let me point out that it is National Popcorn Day, so for the vast audience at home, I'm sure you'll want to push pause and go make yourself some popcorn so you can settle in for a fun meeting this evening. Let's do approval of the agenda. Are there any comments or changes to the agenda this evening? Nope, no comments or corrections, so the agenda is approved by common consent. Next is approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was January 5th. Does anyone have any corrections to the meeting notes? No corrections, so we'll call the meeting notes approved by common consent. Next, non-agenda public comment. So tonight our main agenda item is a discussion about the Housing Action Plan and some of the strategies associated with that. So any public comment for anything else, now is the time. Mary, looks like you're here, so we'll give you the privilege of going first.
Good evening. My name is Mary Wichter, and I've been in Sammamish for 22 years. Just reflecting back on the last meeting in December for you and for also City Council, and last night for the Sammamish Youth Board, I had shared some things called How to Build Community. There's a postcard, same as the bookmark. And then the company that does them is Syracuse Cultural Workers out of Syracuse, New York. And the art is done by some of their people. So it's called How to End Global Warming. And these are things that anybody can do anywhere, anytime. So I just thought they were really inspirational. I first ran across them in 2019 when we were doing vision things and other things, and I was like, how do you build community? And when I Googled it, this is what popped up. So anyway, if you do want more, I do have a couple more sets if you want to share somebody with. And just again, I think it's such a good message. It's remarkable, so I'm remarking again. And instead of recycling or throwing them out, you should be able to pass them on to other people or send them to family. And like I said, if you want an additional copy for somebody, that would be great. Then the second thing is we're also working on climate action plan, and I think you've also heard from some of the Sammamish Youth Board members had spoken quite a bit. I did send in from Bozeman, Montana, where I grew up and still own property, and I attend those meetings. They have a sustainability boards. They used to have about 40 boards, and they kind of got coalesced down into about 5 boards with a few that are sticking around for specific purposes. And those boards are really great. And so the information for setting up the sustainability board, which is one of the super groups that survived, I sent those materials in the last Planning Commission. So I don't know if that's useful to anybody, but I also think if we can't get one formally set up, maybe there are some people of different walks of life or that have resources that would be interested in reading other climate plans that are available, like Issaquah has one, Redmond has one, Woodinville has one, Bellevue has one. Bozeman, Montana has a pretty fine one with a really nice link page and a dashboard. So I was cheered on by Chair Boffman last meeting or the meeting before when he said, hey, if you've never watched other planning boards or planning commissions, you should. They're kind of interesting. So tonight, for non-agenda comment, I had sent in Bozeman, Montana. They have something called the Community Development Board. And they actually, so Code Studio did it, which that's one of the consultants the city's used before, but it's from Austin, Texas, so it's not the same people. But they do a lot of rewriting of code, and they have some really great graphics showing like how houses built look and how they could look and what the floor to area ratio would be, and if you change that or if you change the building coverage, the type of units that you could get out. So rather than trying to simplify their very fine 45-minute presentation, which is about 20 minutes of presentation, about 20 minutes of follow-up questions, that board in Bozeman also has 3 architects on it. It has somebody who's a developer or a realtor. It has people in Montana, per the state, you have to be qualified to actually hold some of those positions. So I'm going to send those to you. They might not come by 5, but hopefully you'll be able to study it between other planning commissions. Thank you.
James Eastman, Sammamish. It's great to be back here. A couple months ago, I was looking through some old photo albums my mom had, and I saw some photos that my great uncle Ted took. And they were all, places he's been all over Washington. And I noticed one of Lake Sammamish. He was with his friends hanging out in Sammamish. It was 1923, so that's exactly 100 years ago. And I went in my mind and I kind of tried to take myself back in time, put myself in Ted's shoes. And, at the time they were living in Seattle. And I think a trek to Sammamish would probably have been an hour and a half, 2 hours. No floating bridge, no freeway system back then. You have to go south towards Renton and then back up the Sunset Highway all the way to Sammamish. And I would have thought that Sammamish was a far out place that people would come to recreate. That's about it. So as I kind of start to reminisce, I think we all kind of reminisce a little bit about, hey, when we first got here, hey, when I grew up here, we kind of take ourselves back in time and remember when. And depending on where we put ourselves, we wish we could go back to a certain point and maybe that neighborhood didn't go in, or maybe that shopping center, this and that. But time just continues to move on, and then eventually we die, and time keeps on moving. So I feel that the past 5 years, we've really just been looking back. Where did we go wrong on traffic? What did we do here? What did we do there? And we've just been stuck in this tunnel vision. And then when it finally came time to look forward, we came up with a plan to, widen Sahalia Way, and I think it was like $350 million. I don't remember the number, but it was astronomical, and we wasted a lot of that time looking back when we could have looked forward. So anyways, that all relates to who I am. I have 100 acres in Sammamish. I have a website, eastlakedevelopment.com, on a future vision that, I think would be relevant in Sammamish. I think the things that I'm proposing withstand the test of time. And I think it's something that we can all look forward to. And as, our neighborhoods grow old and other things grow old, that, there's some mainstays in the community that are always going to be great. The lake, the parks, some of the natural features here. So I'm excited. I hope I can work with you guys. My goal is to be able to engage the Planning Commission, the City Council, and I've been a landowner for 16 years and been probably at these meetings every week for the past 5 or 6 years. So I'm just hoping we can include this in the comp plan, and I can get all your guys' input and really refine and come up with a great plan for my property. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I don't personally plan to get any older, but we'll see how that goes. Do we have anybody else for public comment?
Yes, we have one hand raised, Mr. Stickney. I'm going to promote you to panelist.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. It's Paul Stickney, Sammamish. I'd like to wish Josh Amato and TC Labby a heartfelt thanks for service. Josh dives deep into issues, was a great addition to bringing a well-reasoned and thought-out view to topics. TC had a lot of very genuine things to say, I felt, over time, and it was good of you both to serve. The other thing I'd like to mention is odds are you've already watched it, but I suggest go back and look at Tuesday night's council meeting. There were sort of three fairly notable things that happened: the hearing regarding Treen, public comment, council discussion, the land use presentation by community development and consultant. It had a significant amount of information, and the critical area ordinance update talk was all good. And I noticed that the council retreat is coming up on Saturday, 28th. Checked today in the afternoon. Don't know if there's anything yet on it, but haven't seen any actual agenda posted yet. I've been following council retreats for several years, and in many cases they've been 2 days long. This is a one-day event on Saturday, so keep an eye out on that. Might be interesting to chime in and watch that. Well, that's all I had today for non-agenda. I look forward to hearing this evening's agenda topics. Okay, I'll talk later. Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Mr. Stickney, and we have no more hands raised.
Great. Okay, thanks, everyone. Let's move on to our main agenda item this evening, which is a discussion of strategies associated with the Housing Action Plan. And I'm not sure if Miriam or Jackie is going to introduce Elliot, who's going to do the presentation, but let's go ahead.
I can go ahead and introduce Elliot and just point out that Jackie Belil and David Pyle are both here as well to assist this evening, but Elliot is going to be taking the lead in terms of the presentation. Elliot is our consultant from Community Attributes, Inc., which has been helping us on the Housing Action Plan. So, Elliot, I'm going to share my screen and hand things over to you momentarily. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Miriam, and thank you, commissioners, for having me this evening. Can you all hear me all right?
We can hear you, but it never hurts to speak up a little bit.
I will do my best. Here to provide an update on the Housing Action Plan. Per some earlier comments, we are looking at potential strategies for implementation as part of the Housing Action Plan this evening, and we are looking forward to getting your feedback. I wanted to provide an update on where we're at in the project with regard to the overall timeline before we dive into the strategies themselves. We've been doing community engagement work really throughout the project. There are two color bands on this graphic on screen that represent times where we were really making a concerted effort at engagement. That first color band represents a statistically significant and then a publicly available survey that was done over the summer months. And then we did some additional engagement to include a public meeting and a follow-up survey on these strategies specifically through November and December, but also maybe not represented by the color bands would be targeted stakeholder interviews we've done, other outreach to the community via Connect Sammamish, and additional engagement activities. So really the engagement has been occurring throughout. We also held some focus groups in there with groups identified in your grant with the Department of Commerce that is helping to fund this work. So we feel like we've made a good effort to get as many people as possible engaged in this work. We prepared a housing needs assessment that was largely done in the spring and summer months, but we presented it both to you as a commission and to council in the fall and sent it along to Commerce for approval in October, I believe, if memory serves. That housing needs assessment was a largely data-driven exercise, but it also included findings from the surveys that I spoke to before, and really sort of culminated in a few themes that we wanted to bring forward to prime the conversation around the strategies. So based on the needs that were observed or quantified in that assessment, what strategies, what potential tools are at our disposal that would help us to meet those needs. We're now in the thick of the strategy development phase to this project. We've been working on it the last few months. And as you can see, we intend to continue working on it over the next couple months as we bring together a draft and final housing action plan for adoption. And that adoption process is not quite kicking off yet. I know the graphic says January, but you know, we don't have the housing action plan itself in place now. I think identifying strategies to be included is the final critical step. And after that, we've got a meeting schedule that we'll speak to later, where we'll be coming back to you as a commission and also to City Council at various steps of the approval process for that housing action plan. And before we move on, I just thought I would reiterate the purpose of a housing action plan. I don't want to lose the forest for the trees. There are two primary purposes. The first is to identify strategies or actions that would improve the diversity or increase the diversity of housing types available in Sammamish. And the second primary purpose is to identify strategies or tools that would improve the affordability of housing in Sammamish. And so affordability and diversity are critical to this effort. They are central to this effort. And a lot of the strategies that we'll be talking to tonight speak to one of the two of those or both. We have a number of high priority strategies and tools for discussion, and I can speak more to the thinking that went behind identifying these as high priority, but for the purposes of tonight's discussion, this is where we will focus. And I also want to make sure that we are all on the same page just definitionally for what these mean. So the first is transfer of development rights. The city already has a TDR program, as I'm sure you are familiar, but we'll talk about ways that that program could be adapted to improve either diversity or affordability of housing. Generally, transfer of development rights programs take the development capacity from a parcel in one part of the city and transfer that development capacity to another parcel in another part of the city where that development may be more appropriate. Inclusionary zoning is currently in place in town center, but not in other parts of Sammamish. Inclusionary zoning simply means that units that are affordable at a certain percentage of area median income are required as part of a development project. And different communities structure that differently. That could be 10% of units at 80% AMI, or 20% of units at 100% or 50% of AMI. You've got a lot of latitude there, but that's the intent of an inclusionary zoning program, to require affordable housing units. Development agreements are negotiated contracts with developers that establish standards or desirable characteristics, features of a given development project. Missing middle zoning, we'll talk about in greater detail later, just in terms of defining missing middle and which housing typologies qualify as that. But this would involve amending, I would say, zoning requirements to allow for typologies that may be excluded now under your existing zoning. Accessory dwelling units, I think we all are familiar with this concept, but we have some thoughts about how your existing regulations on accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, could be amended to improve the uptake of this program. Tiny homes, sort of similar in some ways to both missing middle types and ADUs, but tiny homes are not currently allowed, or would need some additional thought about how to regulate if they were to be implemented, but they provide a smaller housing unit that may be a fit for certain individuals or certain family types that is very low in terms of square footage, typically not more than 400 square feet, and may exist on a much smaller lot than would be typical. Housing repair, modification, and preservation program really aggregates a few tools and strategies that we had talked about separately prior to this point in the process. We want to make sure that we are addressing demographic trends, and that could mean aging in place. It could also mean that we're just ensuring the quality of the housing stock so that older homes are available without sacrificing quality to, say, first-time home buyers. So this program, of course, is yet to be designed, but should we move it forward, may allow for technical assistance or financial assistance to repair homes or modify them for design features that would allow those homes to remain useful components of Sammamish's housing stock as the demographic characteristics of the population change. Cottage housing, again, somewhat related to tiny homes, ADUs, and missing middle. Cottage housing is a little bit different in that these homes typically exist on one lot. They may or may not be subdivided. They tend to be bigger than tiny homes, and they tend to be detached. So many of the missing middle types are attached, and that distinguishes cottage housing. But nonetheless, that is a strategy or tool that we feel is ripe for consideration. Partnerships, something you engage in regularly with organizations such as Arch, but there are ways that you could expand your partnerships or invest more heavily in the partnerships that you already have, and that is something we wish to consider. Finally, sub-area planning is a big effort where you would delineate an area of the city geographically, and you would put in place specific plans for those areas. We'll talk more about sub-area planning because it's a rather complex strategy that may take more time to roll out, but it could be an impactful one in the long run. And minimum densities would simply establish benchmarks for, as the name implies, the minimum density permitted in any given zoning district. And you have a few zoning districts where there are minimum densities in place, but the majority of your zoning districts or designations do not have such minimums. This would ensure that you are getting out of individual parcels within zoning districts the development capacity that you thought you were zoning for, thereby producing a greater number of housing units. So that may have been long-winded, but that's a table of contents of sorts for our conversation tonight. We are going to go through each of those strategies that I just overviewed one by one. And on each slide, we have some implementation considerations that we would like you all to offer your thoughts or direction on so that we as a project team can move forward to continue to refine these concepts and take forward those that are appropriate for the Housing Action Plan. As has maybe been implied, given that we are calling the ones in front of you tonight high priority, there have been some criteria that we've employed to determine from a larger list which ought to be up for discussion tonight. And we're certainly welcoming your thoughts if you believe that there are some that we are not discussing that ought to be high priority, or if there are some that we are deeming to be high priority that you feel are inappropriate for that category. But a few of the criteria applied to get to this point from a broader list that may have included 35 or 40 strategies and tools initially was staff recommendations, council recommendations per our meeting with City Council last week, a public recommendation in the form of a survey, and I don't want to overstate the extent to which that survey was representative. We held a meeting in early December that the public was invited to, and some of our thinking around which of these should be prioritized is based on the results of the survey that was given in the wake of that public meeting. And then potential impact in terms of producing additional housing units or more affordable housing units, and the relationship to the planning requirements that either you are currently under with GMA or you may be under given anticipated changes due to things like House Bill 1220, which will require a certain number of housing units at certain specified levels of affordability. So I don't wish to be overly specific in how we've weighted those criteria. I don't claim that we had an especially scientific approach, but we weighed each of those factors in trying to come up with this list for your consideration tonight. Now, on each of the slides where we...
Elliot, can I just, is it all right if we ask questions as we go, or do you want to hold questions? How would you prefer to do that?
We absolutely can ask questions as we go.
Okay. Josh, Commissioner Amato has a question.
On the time needed to implement, it looks like, for example, long it says an action that would carry or not begin until 2 years or later. So it's it's kind of ambiguous. It sounds like it could potentially be like a 4-year project, or it would take 4 years until time to completion. So should we not think of this as time to completion and more like time to start? Or will it be, could you like call out specifically, like it'll take perhaps a year or two to start this and then another year or two to complete this project, if that's clear?
Thank you. I will do my best. I may lean on city staff as well to help fill in some of those gaps, because staff, of course, are more familiar with the current work plan than I am, as well as resources available for implementation. I think one of the critical considerations in our estimation of timeline here is whether or not these can be done in tandem with or in time for adoption of your periodic comprehensive plan update in 2024, because that is a point at time in which you are going to have to demonstrate capacity to meet the new housing unit allocations from King County and the Department of Commerce at those specified levels of affordability. So there's very much a need to identify some tools that can be implemented in the near term such that you can demonstrate that capacity when your comprehensive plan is adopted. And we also understand that thinking too narrowly about the timeframe for implementation may lead us to ignore certain strategies or tools that would have a really big impact in terms of the production of more diverse housing or more affordable housing. And so we've included some that are deemed to be longer term, even if they don't help to meet that immediate need. Okay, I will keep marching. I spoke to a number of things not explicitly on the slide, and I imagine you all have had some time to digest the contents of the slide. Nonetheless, these graphics will show up with each of the slides presenting each individual strategy, low, medium, and high levels of effort, with some criteria for that determination, as well as short, medium, and long time needed to implement with associated criteria. I spoke to the time needed to implement just now. Low, medium, and high, the low items may be things that are ongoing or at least in the existing work plan. Medium would require policy or code changes that would have to come back through Planning Commission and City Council. And high would not just require policy or code changes, it may require entirely new programs or additional funding. It may stretch into new budget cycles in order to access that funding. So those are the ways in which we are sort of bookmarking these various strategies. I can pause for additional questions.
Yeah,
because
just a clarification on this. So the Housing Action Plan has to, I think, be really critical in terms of us meeting a fairly heavy lift in being able to meet the affordability requirements, right? And so it was unclear in what you were going through for the strategies selected about the impact on being able to put in affordable housing. And is that something that we're going to be seeing in here? I don't see it in the slide that's shown right here, and it would seem like it would be a highly weighted criteria for deciding.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we haven't been able to quantify the extent to which any of these strategies would produce units that would meet your allocation, in part because these interventions haven't been fully designed yet. We don't know what parts of the city they would apply to, or we haven't specified what levels of income that we might be targeting. But I think that that's all work in front of us, and I think it's important to understand that even if we can specify those program details or come up with proposals, there are still a number of factors that we can't pin down, such as market interest or broader development conditions that will affect the likelihood that development projects will come through under any of these programs or tools or strategies. But I would also reiterate that this is being done, this housing action plan, in tandem with your comprehensive plan update. So it is informing the update to your land use element. It is informing the update to your housing element, such that when your comprehensive plan is adopted, it is calibrated to show capacity for the number of units you need at the specified affordability levels. And beyond that, I see David has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I had to find the mute button. I agree with everything Elliot said. I just wanted to add one thing, which is as we develop these tools and as we produce a housing action plan, That will be integrated into the housing element of the comprehensive plan. And excuse me, those tools will be modeled in application as part of our land use scenarios that we are considering with our comprehensive plan, which will help us understand if we are going to be providing or planning or accommodating and removing barriers in a way that would accommodate the numbers of units that we're being directed to accommodate by the state and the county. So that really is, this work here is trying to refine the how. Once we've figured out the how and what tools we have in our toolkit that are appropriate for Sammamish, we will then model how those might apply and where those might go and the where and the when. And Elliot did raise some really important components that, we don't control the market. We're not building these as a city. We might be in a position of assisting with funding and partnerships, or other elements like transfer of development rights and units that we might be sending as a city. We own parks, for example. We work with school districts where they could send units. These are all things we'll be discussing. But I think the point here is that we kind of have a idea about how the number of units these might provide in concept. Some examples are comparing, and we'll get into these, and I apologize if I'm getting a little ahead of us here. You could compare infill through things like accessory dwelling units versus redevelopment of a commercial center, and you're not going to get the level of affordability at the 0 to 30% and at the number of units that we need with infill through accessory dwelling units. It's not going to happen. I don't, even without modeling it, I could tell you right now that it's not going to happen. People aren't all of a sudden going to start building 0 to 30% subsidized units in their backyard just because. You have to have some incentive, and it has to happen with other economics involved in it, and that largely ends up being occurring in commercial areas or mixed use areas where you're able to leverage other things like transfer development rights and partnerships and funding and commercial bonuses and all the things that you'll see here in some of these slides. So apologize for getting a little ahead, but I wanted to try to provide the landscape, so to speak, to understand how this all fits together.
I understand that, and thank you. So because affordability is so important, though, and David, what you're just describing is there's some experience. It may not be precise and as I's dotted, T's crossed kind of precision as we might like, but there's some experience from other cities, just like the example you gave with the auxiliary dwelling units, and that won't make it. We won't be able to fulfill the needs. So at some point, it would be helpful to understand the relative impact of the various strategies and to understand why the high priority ones are selected, and are those the most impactful from an affordability standpoint versus the larger number that are not on that high priority list. And perhaps as we go through this, if we could at least touch on some of the the sort of experience that you and others have in these things in terms of the impactfulness, I think that would be helpful.
And I was just going to add, this is Kelly Hildy, Deputy Director. As we go through the strategies, there are strategies that we have in the city today, and I'd be more than happy to report out on those numbers to provide that as an example of its success.
If I could just real quick kind of echo what Mike said, I think I had that same question, and I'm not concerned about identifying numbers or specifics, but in a similar way, I think inevitably we will all evaluate each one as a likely to succeed, unlikely to succeed, unknown. I think that's just a human nature as we look at these, and so it'd be okay to talk about that and make sure we don't lead ourselves down the wrong path of a strategy that we all talk ourselves into the idea that it won't work just because we don't have enough knowledge about it. So we should just pay attention to that.
Yeah, and I would absolutely say that some of the direction that we are looking for tonight is, how to invest additional time to move these forward. So if it is coming back with case studies of implementation in other cities in the Puget Sound region, that's still helpful for us. And we are happy to go and do some of that investigation to fill in any gaps in what we can provide tonight about the potential impact of these programs. I suppose with that, we can dive right in. The first one up is transfer of development rights. We've categorized the level of effort on this as medium, but the time to implement as short, largely because you already have a TDR program, and the mechanism here is probably an expansion of that program rather than creation of a new program altogether. We have some implementation considerations here that we would like to focus the discussion around, although if you have additional concerns or opportunities that you see for a TDR program or for any other, we're happy to hear those as well. The considerations that we have raised are, how should the geographic constraints of Sammamish's TDR program, which is currently limited to town center, be modified? What areas may be appropriate as sending areas? Those are areas to preserve, so places where you are taking development capacity from. And what areas may be appropriate as receiving areas or areas to focus development where you are sending that development capacity to? Should there be a cap on how much development capacity can be transferred to receiving sites? So in theory, the development capacity that is being transferred is in addition to the density that is allowed by right within that zoning district. So it could be the case in certain programs, TDR programs, that you could take capacity from multiple different parcels and take it to another single parcel, which may allow someone to exceed the by right development capacity significantly. So you might consider a cap on that if that's of interest. And then finally, should transfer of development rights include any affordability requirements? So in exchange for taking the capacity from one parcel to another, does some of that extra capacity being allocated to that second parcel have to be used for affordable housing units at 80% AMI or below? I'm happy to speak more to transfer of development rights conceptually, but other than that, happy to take questions or hear the discussion.
Can I add one thing really quickly? This is an item that is already on our work plan for 23-24, and we do have a little bit of budget allocated towards it. So just wanted to put that in.
Anyone have questions? John?
So in past discussions, David's mentioned, one of our highest development capacity areas are existing commercial areas. I'm assuming they would be the most appropriate receiving areas, but I'm not sure about what we would have in the way of sending areas, unless you're specifically talking about open space or wetlands or sensitive areas.
I'd be happy to jump in if you want on that one. So there's a variety of options, and I think as Mary mentioned, we do have budget to work on the TDR program and opportunity to really further. I think the term somebody used earlier, which I found really greatly describes it, is auger into this. In terms of sending sites, we have many areas in the city that will not be developed with housing that could serve as sending sites. Those are also happen to be owned by public agencies that have common interest in providing housing and have a shared responsibility in helping support that for, in many cases, their employees who work in Sammamish. Those are the school districts, the water and sewer districts. Those happen to be the city with parks properties, and that's a big opportunity. We also have a fairly substantial amount of land in the city that is fairly highly encumbered by wetlands and streams and slopes and geologic hazard areas. And we happen to be moving into updating our critical areas ordinance here. We're about to issue our request for qualifications. And as part of that process, we can look closely at the relationship between protected areas in the city, and we could we could quantify to some degree the amount of land that we understand to be encumbered in the city, which would help us understand what that sending, how much potential there is for sending sites. There are also some other things that could be bundled into that. There's different types of tax exemptions that go along with it. There's different types of open space or natural area preservation or conservation that goes along with that. There's a whole, so this is a really wide range of potential for sending sites. And we, so knowing that, I don't know so much that, I guess the question here is what areas may be appropriate as sending areas. So thinking about that list, publicly owned properties, areas that are encumbered by environmental features. You might also find that somebody wants to, maybe they have a large parcel and they want to put half of their parcel in permanent conservation. Would they be able to sell off the density that they could otherwise put in their backyard if they put a conservation easement over their backyard and transfer that off? Is that an option? So I think those are all things to consider. One thing to keep in mind is that we have had a fairly significant uptick over the last 5 years in pressure to develop properties that I would classify as probably shouldn't be developed under the reasonable use exceptions that we have. Washington State has a fundamental right to private property, and as such, we cannot take someone's property rights by zoning controls. And if our zoning controls render property to have no other feasible economic use, it's considered to be a taking, and as such, we could be challenged with a takings claim in court. So we have to have a relief valve to allow for alternative economic use of property. So keep that in mind as well, as a transfer development rights program allows us to really truly protect those areas that should be protected, aquatic resources, geologic hazards, et cetera. And it allows us to provide, a real simple alternative economic use by redirecting those units of density or those residential uses to other areas that are more appropriate as receiving sites. So I'll be quiet.
David, it seems like this is such a complicated question and you have money to work on it. Coming back with some staff recommendations would be an appropriate way for us to best use our time.
Oh, Carrie, go ahead. Let me just a quick comment. I think that there's, because of the existing program that has maybe not done as much as some people thought that it could have or should have, or at least as a perception, I think as we proceed with developing something new, we need to think about good communication and good explanation for the community so that we can build some community support around the idea that this isn't the same old that didn't really seem like it worked. And at least the perception is that it didn't really work. So I think that making sure that we're very clear about how things are different is going to be important. I would also just wanted to make the comment on that last number 3, affordability requirements. I would say in general, I think that because we're going to try to reinvent something and I don't quite want to say try something new, but in some ways we're going to try something a little bit new for the city by changing this to a different type of program. I would be cautious about adding in more and more restrictions and requirements that make it more convoluted and complicated. I think we want to probably start out with something that's pretty frictionless and that has some good guardrails, and we can see how it works. And then perhaps later, either through other means, we can impose the affordability requirements that we need, or maybe that just goes with the development agreements or someplace else. But I think we need to try to keep this simple and make it work, and then see where we need to go from there.
Chair Boffman, I couldn't agree more, and I thank you for your comments. We do have some lived experience with the Transfer of Development Rights Program. I did provide a presentation back in September on our current program and what those challenges are with our current program. Because of that, I think that's going to inform this strategy quite a bit. And so, as Miriam said, we are bringing back the TDR program. I think some of these questions and getting your feedback regarding affordability, if there should be a cap, and if we should include an affordability requirement, it would be great to get your feedback on that as we're developing these strategies. For example, in our current TDR program, I want to say it's 600 and some units is the cap that can be transferred from a sending site into the town center sub area. So that's what that's an example of what that cap is. Anyway, thank you.
Carrie, I think you had a comment.
Sure. I think I'm glad this is on the top of the list, but I was worried that, because of our challenges, that it could get bogged down. So I'm encouraged that the way that it was described tonight is it's already there, and we obviously know, what is and what isn't working. So if that's a positive, and thus that makes it medium and then short time to implement, that's good to hear. So thank you for that. And then when I was looking through the packet tonight, someone had mentioned the Kirkland housing dashboard, so I did look at that. And so I was thinking, can't dashboard everything, but it potentially, since we have some funds, this might be an interesting place to do that, since we do have ideas of places, and that's something maybe the whole community could kind of get behind and kind of like to track, because it speaks to a lot of different concerns or desires. So that was just some feedback.
Josh, did you have something?
I do. I'll go down the list. The geographic constraints, this TDR program should be limited to property within the Sammamish city limits and not Bless King County. Areas appropriate as sending sites, I think that's a good question to ask as we're looking at all of the different strategies we're trying to implement and see about ways that we can incorporate TDRs into those discussions, and maybe not think of this in a vacuum, but think of it holistically as we're looking at all these other options and see if TDRs are a good solution there. I'm sorry, receiving areas. For sending areas, I meant that for receiving areas. Sending areas is a much more complicated item that I haven't fully wrapped my head around. I'm concerned about using areas that really couldn't be built on anyway, and transferring rights from there, because we're not, if the idea is to protect some of this property, it's not actually protecting it because it can't be used, unless, as David was saying, it could theoretically be used if someone pushed hard enough. So I guess that's something I need to understand a little bit better in order to wrap my hand around what kind of policy I'd be interested in accepting. On number 2, should there be a cap? Probably, but I don't know enough yet. And then affordability requirements, again, I think that goes back to what I think the receiving area should be. We should probably look at that as we're identifying all these other strategies and see how TDRs might play into them to see if affordability requirements match up. And those are my comments on an adjusted TDR program.
TC, Commissioner Labby, you have your hand up.
Hello. Thank
Hi.
you, everyone. I guess my primary concern is, as we allow for these TDRs to shift into other areas of, higher density, do we run the risk of over encumbering the land for what it can actually sustain? So if we get all 600 of these TDR units approved and we go pack them in somewhere, are we now kind of forcing more units into a geographical area than what that area can support by zoning or by practical application, right? Is that something that is accommodated for? Do we have a plan around that?
Ellie, do you want?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think I'll echo what Commissioner Amato said. I think it needs to be done holistically and with consideration to those sub areas. So as you're studying those sub areas, what is the infrastructure capacity and its potential to be improved? I think all that just needs to be discussed in the same, as part of the same discussion. Did I answer your question?
Kelly, I was wondering if you could just quickly highlight within the context of town center and the 600 units of TDRs that might be allowed there, how that works within the cap for town center as a whole, just so, as an example.
Yeah, so town center has a cap of 2,000, and the allocated density is, 1,656. I will need to verify that number. And so that difference is 300, is that 364? So yeah, so allocated density is 1,656, and then the density that would come from TDRs are from incentive pools would be 364. So yes, that cap exceeds that bonus at 364. So it really is kind of a race to what is going to make up that difference between allocated and the cap in the town center. So that could come from TDRs. It could also come from other incentive pools.
So what are the environmental impacts to going above and beyond what it's been zoned for, been specified? Why put out there a 1,600 and change unit limit and then say, well, yeah, but you can go to 2,000 and we'll grab these units from somewhere else, right? Like it.
Yeah. So, sorry.
If the environment can support 1,600 or 1,650 units, then that's how many you can build, right? Like.
Yeah, so an EIS was done prior to the town center plan being adopted and the development regulations being adopted, and the EIS studied 2,000 units. Anything above that would need to be further studied for environmental impacts. So the EIS studied the allocated density and that additional 356 units of bonus density. So that's all included in there. Anything above 2,000 needs to have a further environmental review before it can proceed.
Okay, anybody else have questions or comments about TDRs? At least for right now.
I will add, because I did promise Commissioner Brusco, we have had 4 TDRs actually attached to an application in the city. So this is an area of improvement that is needed.
Okay, let's, I think we can move on to the next strategy.
Excellent. Thank you for the feedback. The next strategy is inclusionary zoning. As you can see, we have identified the level of effort as medium and the time to implement as medium. It should be noted that some inclusionary zoning provisions are included, but only in town center. The implementation considerations we have flagged for discussion are whether or not there are any areas in Sammamish that are not suitable for inclusionary zoning if we were looking to broaden the geographic reach of this program. What financial incentives would be the most appropriate or effective in expanding inclusionary zoning, and how would incentives impact the city? How could program changes, such as the percent of units required or the number of units required or the level of affordability required for those units, impact housing production? And should there be an elimination of the in lieu fee option? Just to say a little bit more about that, most inclusionary zoning programs, or I suppose many, I don't know definitively that it is most, but many offer developers of a given project to pay a fee on a per unit or per square foot basis to get out of providing the affordable units, with that fee then going into an affordable housing fund where those dollars are leveraged by a housing authority of one sort or another to actually develop housing units that are deemed affordable. So those are the subjects for discussion.
Before we start, and could maybe somebody help me understand a little bit better about what do we currently have in the city and what do we not have?
So the town center sub-area has inclusionary zoning. The requirement is any development has to provide 10% in affordable housing. So if you're proposing a 100-unit development, 10 of those units would need to be affordable. In addition to that, we incentivize affordable housing incentivize development to build affordable housing by giving bonus density. It's similar to what I was speaking to with the TDRs. There is an affordable housing bonus pool. So if a developer pulls from that bonus pool, they get additional market rate units to help incentivize building those affordable units. That program has been successful in that the affordable housing bonus pool has pretty much been exhausted. There are no more units. Those have all been attached to applications that have been approved, are currently under review. The amount of affordable housing that is planned and are built, and I have that up here, is about 102 units to date, with more to come because we've only built out a portion of the town center, so there's more affordable housing coming. So it's a requirement to build affordable housing, but then we also incentivize additional affordable housing beyond that requirement. And I would say that has been successful.
And how does our current set of programs define affordable?
So our code defines it as 80% AMI.
Okay, questions or comments? Carrie?
Yes. So I believe the other night at the city council meeting, at least council member Amy Lamb did not want to eliminate, the elimination of the in lieu fee option, and I would agree with that. And let's see what else. If we are, there's been a lot of talk about the other mixed use areas, and so if those were sort of to move along and maybe they're incorporated in other strategies, would this sort of, if this was something we wanted to do, would you then kind of make sure that that was included in those other areas? Would they kind of work together? Like a combo?
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier, and to me, even though we're looking individually at each of these strategies, it's really how they come together as a bundle. And is this the right bundle to move us to where we want to be and address the needs that were identified through the housing needs assessment? Or does the bundle need to look a little bit different? And so that's, I think, what we're aiming to get out of the conversation tonight is not just are each individual strategy the right ones, but do they work together in the way that we'd like them to?
Okay. And I think, so back to the numbers that Kelly, that you were sharing, I recently printed out the ARCH units in the area, and I saw Sammamish was on there, and I wish I had that in front of me now. Do we have units that are less than 80% AMI for affordable housing?
That is correct, and I think Miriam can provide more information on those units.
I can. I would need to do it when I'm not sharing my screen, but I'm happy to send that out. We do have some units that are, I believe, at the 50%, but I'd need to double check my numbers. I'm happy to send that out to the Planning Commission after the meeting.
Yeah, I think I have it. I just don't have it in front of me either. So I guess to this point, if we were going to do this to help support some of the targets we would need, would this need to be modified so that it included lower brackets?
I would say yes.
Okay. That would seem to...
I would agree.
This would be a place where it seems like that would make sense, maybe, versus to Chair Boffman's point, not so much attaching it to the TDRs, if that makes sense.
Can I just ask, can you clarify? I didn't quite track. Are you saying that you're in favor of eliminating the fee or not in favor of eliminating the fee?
I don't want to eliminate the fee. Sorry. Not in favor of eliminating. Let's make sure I get that right. I do not want to. No. No, do not want the in lieu fee.
I think we should call it something, maybe we should describe it differently because it is kind of a double negative that
I would rather
trips you up.
I would rather the inclusionary zoning stay within Sammamish and not get put into the fund and be used elsewhere or for other things.
So not allowed as an option, that they either build it or they pay this fee.
I just think of it as a get out of jail card, and I think when I think about it that way, it's easier to see how it operates.
Yeah.
It is an option in the town center sub-area regulations under the affordable housing section, but it's never been utilized.
And then to just clarify my last point, I would want to, have affordable housing be more, hooked into this to help with our targets versus, say, the TDR program where let's get that up and running and have it help in other ways without having a lot of rules and restrictions for the targets.
Josh, you had some?
I just clarifying question on, these are not limited to units that are rentals, correct? These could be purchased and owned by an individual?
Yes, it's owner and rental properties. So
is this attached to, I don't know how it would work, attached to the title, so it's required that it maintain, okay.
yeah, they have to, so Arch oversees that work for us. So there are agreements that are in place that are recorded to title, and I believe it is a 50-year commitment for that property once it's identified and built as an affordable unit. It needs to be an affordable unit for 50 years.
Okay, and then is this a means-tested item before someone can rent or purchase? And then is that, means-tested might not be the right word, but is there like proof that they fit within the threshold that we've set? And then is that, if say in a rental unit, checked again, right? Like if someone's in between jobs or something and then land their Microsoft gig, how do we determine that they no longer fall within that need zone?
I don't know the specifics of that. I know there is a qualification process at initiation. I can't speak to how that's monitored. I'm not sure if anyone else, any of the other presenters have any experience with that may be able to answer that question.
I can follow up with Arch to find out specifically what they do, but typically, yes, there's a monitoring process and income is reviewed. They have to show proof of their household income for the year using pay stubs and things like that. So it is typically monitored.
At a minimum, it's done at lease renewal. So if you're signing a year-long lease, it's done once a year. It can be done more often than that. My understanding is that it varies, but I'm also not super familiar with the specifics. So I think Miriam's suggestion that we follow up with Arch is apt.
I just want to make sure it's not like, I don't know, like an East Coast rent-controlled building or something where, once you got it, you got it. It doesn't matter how your income's changed over time. So, and on financial incentives, I don't know, but I am curious if you have heard from anyone on what would make building more of these financially viable, especially when you start getting down into the lower AMI levels. So I'd be curious if we had like a list of like, here are the things that people said would make this possible, or if they're just going to wash their hands and say in Sammamish, probably not possible. So understanding that would be helpful.
Yeah, actually, I can speak to that because we are starting to hear that in the town center, as there's a lot of interest in the town center right now and for development. And really, it comes to density, being allowed to build more market rate units. And with the affordable housing incentive pool now exhausted, I think that's a conversation we got to bring back to council and look at doing some code updates on. But it really comes down to, hey, we'll build affordable, but we want more market rate units in return. That seems to be a big motivator.
Okay. And then, is there right now in this item that we're talking about you just mentioned, what's the ratio? Is there a proposed one at the moment, or?
So for the town center, it is for every affordable, it is, oh gosh, I'm going to have to look up the code and follow up with you on that one. And it's also, it's dependent. So the code is written to get 80% AMI, but there is incentives, more density if you build at 50 or 30%. So I need to look at those ratios more closely, and then I can follow up with you on that.
Okay.
With a whole planning commission.
So to vocalize my concern, it's that we've got such a strong goal that we likely have to hit. My concern would be that we don't end up with, housing units or buildings that are just low-income areas. That's not an end result we're looking for. So that would be my only, and I'm sure that's something you folks are paying attention to as well.
Absolutely. So. And I think that's why inclusionary zoning is a great tool. Again, you look at town center, and there's 100, I think it's like 56 that are built right now. You can't tell where those units are because they're mixed in with market rate units. You can't look at one specific townhome over at Southeast Townhomes right at kitty corner to us and say, oh, that one's the affordable one, because it looks exactly like the market rate. And this is the benefit of inclusionary zoning. You make it a requirement that a percentage needs to be affordable at a certain AMI, and you include that with market rate units. So I hope that alleviates the fears of some of the East Coast housing developments that are all affordable. This is a really good option, and it's not only been proven successful here, it's in many cities, Kirkland, Issaquah, and I know Whatcom County and Bellingham is starting to look at doing this as well. So it's a good option.
Okay. And then my final one is on the in lieu fee. I'm assuming that goes into the amount that we're paying to Arch. Or in some way, is that?
That's a good question. Because it hasn't been utilized, and that we'd most likely provide that to Arch because they do manage our affordable housing program now. But again, I think that's something that we need to look in further. And because it hasn't been utilized, it hasn't really been defined. We need to look into that.
Okay. My concern with having it is, and it going to Arch, is that, we pay a couple $100,000 a year or whatever it is to Arch, and then we don't necessarily get all that great credit or much credit as Sammamish for having affordable housing units built in other cities. And if Sammamish is going to be required to have a certain level of affordable units, and we're going to just kick them out of here by way of fee to Arch and then another city, that doesn't seem like a great option for us hitting our goal, unless we can in some way ensure that whatever fee is paid results in, it being utilized for another affordable housing option here in Sammamish. So that's my concern with the fee. I'm not saying get rid of it, but if we do have it, I'd want to make sure we get, proper credit for whatever's built from it.
I believe the code does specify money that is collected in that fee in lieu goes to Sammamish directly. So it has to be used here.
Great. That's it. Thank you, everyone.
Mike?
This may state the obvious, but you'd mentioned about these various strategies working together. And for the first item here about any areas in Sammamish not suitable for inclusionary zoning, the sub-area planning would be a way to determine that, right? So we should be able to look at sub-areas and say, like Town Center was, awesome for inclusionary zoning, and other areas, not so much. And so as part of the work that's going on, to be able to start to identify what sub-areas would be appropriate, because it seems from everything that we've heard that the inclusionary zoning really checks a lot of boxes in terms of diversity and affordability, and in ways where the density can be best utilized. So I thought I'd point that out as we think about this, because I'm trying to wrap my head around a little bit like, how these all fit together. And that was one that seemed kind of obvious to me, but, and so it'll be helpful once we move, further into the planning phases to understand which areas, sub-areas would make sense or not.
Go ahead, John.
I realize we're in a blue sky kind of looking at everything, but on the downside, are there just some things that are not practical that we shouldn't even be considering, either in the mix or individually? I kind of look to staff to say, well, that's going to be too expensive to track, or we don't have the resources to do that. Just kind of keeping that in the back of our mind. We don't want to be promoting something that we can't do.
I will say, I do think that was one of our goals in creating this kind of high priority list, is filtering that out a little bit for you. So hopefully the ones we're considering tonight are all somewhat implementable or in line with a direction that we think would be good.
TC, did you have any questions or comments? Sounds like no. I just a couple comments about inclusionary zoning. Philosophically, I'm more of I prefer incentivizing the marketplace, cajoling, encouraging, that sort of thing. However, if we, and I think we can't get away from this. If we are going to have difficult, draconian requirements imposed on us as a city, then we probably need to no longer be the nice guys. We may have to be more firm in these kinds of programs and put it in as requirements. And because otherwise we're caught in the middle of trying to talk people into doing the right thing and being told by someone above us that we have to live up to it, and we're the ones set up to fail. This is one of those examples where I think, even though I don't love the program becoming more rigid, I think that may be an option we have to consider in order to try to meet the requirements that are going to be imposed on us. Otherwise, we're putting ourselves in a kind of a difficult position. Anyone else before we move to the next strategy? Okay. Elliot, next.
Next up is development agreements. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. They have been used in Sammamish in the past. I think there are even one or two very recent examples. We have described the level of effort as medium and the time to implement as short, and we flagged as implementation considerations for discussion to what extent should development agreements address the level of affordability of affordable units in a development and the number of affordable units in a development. So not the first time those two have come up, right? Those are often the levers that you have to pull with many of these programs with regards to affordable housing. And then also, should contract rezoning or concomitant agreements, and we can talk more about those definitionally if we need to, be included as alternative tools to development agreements when applicable?
Yeah, Elliot, can we get a little bit more definition for item 2? You kind of hinted at that, but let's go ahead and try to do that a little bit.
Absolutely. Concomitant agreement is an agreement recorded against the title of a piece of land, like an individual parcel that binds the property to certain terms and conditions over a specified period of time. Contract rezoning allows the rezoning of an individual parcel subject to certain considerations or concessions by the landowner or the developer. So in many ways, they are similar to development agreements. They have some subtle differences and distinctions that I suppose we can elaborate on if they are helpful to the conversation. But in my mind, I think you could explore these implementation considerations and they would not be dissimilar conversations across all three tools. So that's why we're sort of presenting them as one.
could you give an example, or maybe I could, my interpretation would be the development agreement allows for exceeding the zoning as long as the excess results in double the affordable housing, and then that's recorded on the title that those have to remain as affordable units. Is it that kind of a thing, or is this more related to features that could change over time or something like that?
So I might defer to David to give some insight as to how these have been used or not used in Sammamish, but I think it is not the case with 2 of the 3 that you would typically exceed the zoned development capacity. So with a development agreement, you likely would not exceed the zoned development capacity. You'd still be held to that total per the underlying zoning. You might be talking about other features of the development that you would be asking for within the agreement. That could be open space, it could be affordable units, it could be any number of sort of site-specific conditions. And then with concomitant agreements, I don't believe you would be exceeding the zoned capacity. I do believe that with contract rezoning, since we're talking about rezoning the parcel from one designation to another, that could ultimately increase the number of units or the density allowable on that given parcel.
Go ahead, David.
I would agree with what Elliot said, but I would add one refinement that in the case of a development agreement, it's really more partnering to provide what the zoning will allow. A development agreement cannot allow for something the zoning does not accommodate. So what it would be doing is say a site is subject to inclusionary zoning and you're going to get 10% of the units at 80% AMI. Well, if the city wanted to go into a development agreement and offer up some sort of incentive through development agreement, and in turn the developer was going to build 20% of the units at 30% AMI, that is something you could do. And what that is simply doing is it's trying to turn the dial to help, sway the hand of the developer to do a little more affordability or something that's more beneficial to the community in exchange for some concessions from the community. With regard to the concomitant agreement, it depends. That's like it could result in more density. It just depends on how it's applied. Concomitant agreement can be applied with a rezone, and it's a condition that's added by the legislative body at the end of the rezone that would require a certain level of affordability. And what that means is that you're setting the density as part of the rezone. So with that setting of density, you're incorporating a requirement that a certain amount be built, basically adding that inclusionary requirement. With contract rezoning, that is a legislative action where you are actually setting the zoning. So you're not necessarily going to cause for an increase in the units being built. You're going to actually create through zoning an increase in the units being built. So that's the difference in those tools. Like Elliot said, they all are very similar in a lot of ways. There are just some nuances to how they're ultimately passed and created, and ultimately, if the city has to provide some incentive, or there's a whole bunch of different ways to look at these, but they all ultimately try to achieve the same thing.
Actually, a quick clarity. So what is implemented currently in Sammamish, and how has that been working? Or not?
We have a development agreement that we just passed with STCA. It doesn't address affordability, but what it does address is other community amenities and consolidated stormwater design and basically an enhanced product that will be built. We anticipate further development agreements with STCA that hopefully will start to include just some components around density, or excuse me, affordability.
Okay, who has questions or comments on this topic? John, go ahead.
So it sounds more like this is a tool that we throw in the toolbox, and particularly that's covered in the comp plan, but the exact details of how it's used are going to vary dramatically depending on the project. So we could have goals in the comp plan that push for affordable units if it's appropriate, but it'll be up to staff recommendations and then finally council adoption for an individual agreement. Would that be accurate?
Yes, that would be accurate.
Mike, did you have something? Go ahead.
So, correct me if I'm wrong here and help me understand those who might be listening. It seems to me that by proper zoning, by other tools that we've talked to, we can achieve maybe the same thing in a way that's more transparent and less up to individual negotiations, which could always bring some concerns. Is that a correct understanding? Should I rephrase?
Yes, could you rephrase? Thank you.
Well, it just, so one of the objectives of, say, a development agreement would be to allow certain density, for example, and or other needs that we see as a city. And that would be the same, except more so with the contract rezoning. And in both cases, in a sense, especially when you get to the items in number 2 here, it seems it would be better if we had zoning in place, inclusionary zoning, sub-area plans that would say, here's what we're wanting to do as a city, rather than have, in a way, separate negotiations through these various agreements. They take longer, and they're not as transparent to the citizens, and could raise questions. So it was really more my understanding about how these work, and if the other tools are actually better in terms of the transparency and the understanding that our citizens will have. Did that help? Because it was silence after I asked the first time, so it's a little scary there.
I think that helps, and I know David touched on this. With a development agreement, there is RCWs that, so you can't use a development agreement as a way to circumvent the code. So, the closest example, and I speak about town center because I'm very into town center business as part of my job. So that's what I live every day. We do have code sections that talk about using units that have been allocated to the town center D zone, which is the civic center here. But to be able to use those units or purchase those units from the city, you have to provide a number of amenities that exceed what is already required. That's all codified, and you could use a tool like a development agreement to negotiate with the developer on which of those additional amenities you want. I could see something similar with affordable housing. So within sub areas or other areas of the code, you can start putting some framework around that and then negotiate those details with the developer. David, did I miss anything, or is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I agree with what you said. The only thing I would add in response to Commissioner Bresco's comments was that I agree that having the zoning in place is more transparent because it is there. You see what's allowed. So long as they conform to the zoning, they can build what they're allowed to build. But as Kelly was saying, the development agreement is a way, and Chair Boffman talked about this. Boffman talked about this a bit earlier. We sometimes need those tools to try to sway the hand of the developer. Well, the development agreement is a way to kind of get them across the finish line and really get the product that we really want out of them. And so often it might be, if we're going to do a rezone and create the zoning, we would probably want to add a concomitant agreement to it, a condition that requires it. And we probably would also require some form of inclusionary zoning as part of that zoning district. And then when somebody buys the property, or the property owner, or whoever owns it now or something, wants to build on it, and they're sort of, you know, they're going to give us something that meets the code, but it's not quite what we think is the best product. Maybe there's opportunity to come to the table with a development agreement and get some extra density in there through TDRs that we can pull from a park site or something, and trade that off for the right product with the right affordability and the right amenities. So ultimately, it's thinking about how all these tools fit together. You know, there might be tools that could be used in one-off scenarios, and that's great. But I think that the more powerful is the combination of the tools when the conditions present themselves to really leverage multiple things and get the highest of value for the project, for the community, and in meeting the mandate that the draconian mandate that we're required to meet.
And I was just going to add a note on the geographic scope of these tools, and very much in the spirit of what David said about combining the tools and how that potentially increases the power that they have to help you meet your requirements. It would be one thing if inclusionary zoning were going to be applied citywide, but that may not be pragmatic. And if it's not, then one thing development agreements do allow you to do is take site-specific approaches where you do not have things like inclusionary zoning in place. So it definitely allows you to be a little bit more precise with how you treat certain site conditions, certain project characteristics, and things like that on a case-by-case basis. And that alone may make it useful for consideration.
And I'll just add one last note on development agreements. They are required to have a public hearing as well as complete a SEPA, environmental review. So there is transparency with development agreements. And we just went through one late last year as an example. So
That's super helpful. Thank you. One other comment, I guess, is that there's some specific questions like level of affordability, number of affordable units. And from what I understand, this was an area that I struggle with a little bit more, obviously. It would seem if there's a way to put some sort of, kind of guide rails, but still allow a lot of flexibility. Rather than, and this goes back to some of the other conversations, we don't want to make the wheels so tough, right? But we still need to be able to achieve our goals. And not knowing the details, I do wonder if there's some, like I said, these guide rails that would say within this kind of scope, the planning department has a lot of flexibility in making this work because it will advance us towards our ultimate goals, rather than say the specific numbers or AMI or whatever.
I think you can do that by having it codified. And setting the framework in the code. A lot of cities have code around development agreements. Issaquah is a really great example of that. And I can actually send you that information on how they use development agreements and to ensure they're getting affordable units as part of that development. So I'll provide that.
Josh, how about you? Yeah.
Is there a project size or scope that typically is that a development agreement would be typically used on? I guess, is there a floor is what I'm asking. I realize it could be used on large projects, but on smaller projects. Should I give an example of what I'm thinking of so you can understand how?
I'm going to defer to Elliot because I've only worked on one development agreement here at the city. He probably has more experience.
I'd very much welcome the example, but you are right that there is a floor. I don't know that it's a hard floor, and I don't know that I can quantify it for you, but because development agreements tend to be more appropriate for projects of some degree of complexity or where some of these community benefits and such come into play, it is the case that they are typically employed with larger projects.
And the example is the Brownstone West subdivision in Town Center. It is little over 4 acres and 38 units. So it's a subdivision, not a large subdivision, but it is a subdivision. That's the size of that project.
Okay, let me see if this might fit here. So the X factor at this point, I think, is what the legislature might hand down to us as far as mandated zoning requirements. So that's kind of the box I'm thinking in. Could this potentially be an item that's used in, say, an R4 zone that all of a sudden a property owner now can build, I don't know, 8 units on, and then we've got some TDRs that transfer over, and now we're looking at a potentially R12 area with a is that an area, is that a situation where a development agreement could be used or would be used? Is this a way we need to think about this item?
So I don't think so in that case, because what that would be doing is an increase of density beyond what the code would allow. If the code allowed, if the TDR program allowed for the transfer of development rights and therefore an increase in density on a receiving site, and what we were doing is a development agreement to try to get units that fit in the 0 to 30% AMI, and we were giving them the TDRs for free or at a reduced rate in exchange for them producing the units at a different level of affordability, that would be the case. But a development agreement could not be used to direct TDRs to a site to increase the density beyond what the zoning would allow if there was not already a zoning provision for transfer of development rights that would let that happen.
So, I think I understand that. I guess what I'm asking is we've got a whole lot of policies here that are still up in the air, and that's where I was getting at. Like, if we do develop a TDR program that does allow something like that, and we have the legislature adjusting zoning in the city, that's where. So at that point, there technically wouldn't be it wouldn't be disallowed by zoning, is where I was kind of getting at. If we adopted policies that allowed that, and then so on a smaller development in that instance, I was asking if a development agreement would come into place, and I hope I'm being
sure. It would either be simply by way of, it might, that's something you could flesh out with the TDR code, right? You could do that, but in the case that the city is selling or giving the sending units from, say, a city park property to a R4 site for them to add, that we then could be in some control over the level of affordability that goes along with those units, and that would be done through a development agreement.
Okay, and on that same example, say that we codified that if there was a certain housing unit that's built at a certain AMI, then we could talk about reducing setbacks, for example. If that was in the code, that would be something where a development agreement would have to take place in order for that sort of trigger to.
It also could be allowed outright by code, right? That could be something that is a code provision. I think the development agreement is more likely to be used if say the city, say there was a frontage improvement and the city had a road project going through there, and the developer would be required to pay for the frontage improvements. Well, the city could do a development agreement and say, hey, developer, instead of paying us for the development agreements, why don't you make 3 more of your units 0 to 30% AMI, and we'll forego the payment on the frontage improvement cost.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's more like horse trading, but it would not allow for anything to be built that would not otherwise be allowed to be built by code. It's more along the lines of who's paying for it? How does the math and the back end work? Those are the types of things that tend to be addressed with a development agreement.
Okay. On item 2, contract rezoning, would that necessitate a decoupling of our land use map from our zoning map? Or, so I see a smile.
Yeah, I think it would. I think that you would probably see a change in futures land use map, and then there would be corresponding rezoning that would occur, and that would be the opportunity to either do a contract rezone. If somebody, usually a contract rezone is in response to somebody who has picked a property that has potential to be rezoned, but wants some specific concessions around what exactly could be built and how it looks and feels. Like, they don't like the on the shelf zoning controls. So what they'll do is they'll say, hey, I want to rezone this from R18 to mixed use as it's or community business or neighborhood business or whatever as it's allowed, because the futures land use map allows that. But they say, I want to go to create a new unique zone for this property that is neighborhood business 1. And you'll do a contract rezone to do a neighborhood business 1. And in return, they're going to do certain things that you want them to do. So it's kind of like doing a development agreement of sorts, but it's also at the same time setting the zoning controls for what can go on that property through a legislative process. It's a little more complex. It requires you go through the entire rezone process. And you also have to, at the same time, kind of rewrite the zoning controls, write zoning controls for the contract zone that you're creating, if that makes sense.
It does. And if the future land use map doesn't match up with what someone's hoping to do, do they have to first fight then to get that changed through the docket process in the end? Okay.
Yep.
So that's a big hurdle if it's not set up. Okay, but so in theory, I kind of like that idea because it has to go through lots of steps, and someone can come up with a relatively neat idea that fits what residents of Sammamish might be looking for. So, from what I know of it right now, that seems like an idea we should probably explore a bit more. And thank you, everyone. That's all I've got on that.
Go ahead, Carrie.
I'll keep it real short. Both Commissioner Bresco and Commissioner Amato covered everything I wanted to cover, so ditto.
High five. TC?
Nothing for me.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying nothing for me.
All right, I have a couple questions. One, who currently is the responsible negotiator on behalf of the city? I think I do a little bit of negotiating in my day job, so who's responsible for that is a kind of an important thing. And then, practically speaking, what is this really asking? Because I perceive that we have development agreement options right now, and I think this is just asking to increase the latitude of what that negotiation can look like to include affordability or housing diversity as a bargaining chip. Maybe that's not the best term to use, but and if that's the case, how do we accomplish this? Is this a code modification, or is it? I mean, it's shown level of effort in medium. Is that? It seems like giving more authority to negotiate should be a fairly straightforward thing, or maybe I'm not understanding that part of it.
So first of all, the first question is who's responsible for negotiating? That's the city manager. So it's whoever the city manager or their designee is would be responsible for negotiating on behalf of the city. That then results in briefings back to the city council. It could be passed through the planning commission if the council so desired. That's an option. I think really we first would want to add elaborate on this type of tool in the housing action plan. Use the housing action plan to help guide planting policy in the housing element of the comprehensive plan. That housing element would also cross-pollinate into the land use element of the comprehensive plan. And that would then result in a corresponding code construction in the land use code, the development regulations, and it just really depends on how far we want to go. I think Kelly raised an example of Issaquah and their development agreement code. Really, it has to start at the policy level. Right now, we're silent on it, so it's challenging for us because we have to get council direction to really take it on. Whereas if we had it planted in policy as a result of a housing action plan in the comp plan, then I feel like we would have more direction to initiate it and bring the council along, of course. But there's already direction as a matter of policy direction for us to pursue that type of action and enhancement of projects.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Okay, Elliot, let's move on to the next one.
Up next is missing middle zoning or missing middle housing. We have a graphic here that is from the firm Opticos Design that illustrates the typologies that are typically included in the definition of missing middle. It may be difficult to see, so they include duplex, cottage court, fourplex, townhouse, triplex, multiplex, or quadplex, courtyard building, and live work. I think most conversations around missing middle types focus on sort of the duplex, fourplex, triplex, and maybe townhouse types, although these others are certainly in play. We have categorized both of these in terms of level of effort and time to implement as medium. And in terms of implementation considerations, we're wondering which of these missing middle housing types would you specifically find to be suitable for Sammamish? Should the types vary by zoning district, and if so, how? And is it more appropriate to facilitate missing middle housing through zoning district amendments, a floating or overlay zoning district, or something else?
Elliot, could you quickly explain, please, what the difference is between a just zoning district amendment and a floating or overlay zoning district?
Yeah, it typically is distinguished by what is allowed by right versus what is allowed via certain conditions. So a floating district may be conditioned on certain aspects of the development plan. If we just took the straightforward zoning district amendment, we would be saying that these types are allowed by right. So they show up in the permitted uses chart in your zoning code or something to that effect. And there are no conditions needed to be met in order to build those types in the zone in which they are allowed.
Okay, who'd like to go first? Well, volunteers. John, go ahead.
This seems like a really complicated one for the future land use map. The graphic here shows kind of the wedding tier, the classic wedding tier of putting the missing middle housing in between the mid-rise commercial multi-use and detached single family. So I guess I'd want to know from staff, is an overlay district or an outright zoning change going to work better for our situation where we already have probably detached, butted right up against mid-rise and multifamily and commercial areas? How do we fit these into the middle housing into our zoning plan without disrupting existing neighborhoods?
I should just clarify, the overlay can also be a means of achieving geographic specificity. So if you thought that it was appropriate to allow certain missing middle types in an R4 or an R8 in certain parts of the city, but not in other parts where the same R4 zoning or R8 zoning applies, you could allow them by way of an overlay zone. And so I bring that up now, not just to rectify the exclusion a couple minutes ago, but also to say that I think you can employ different strategies here. It's not necessarily an and I'm sorry, it's not necessarily a forced choice. I think there may be certain parts, say in a given commercial center, where you think that the zone by right should allow these things, and a different part of the city that maybe isn't as well served by infrastructure or something to that effect, where you think only conditionally should these housing types be allowed. So there is a situation in which you could answer both to question number 3.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I have, I guess, one quick definitional and then a suggestion. So the cottage court here, is that the same as one of the other strategies, just called cottage housing? Or are they slightly different?
I would say for all intents and purposes, they're the same. The actions that we might be considering in terms of how you encourage that housing type could be different.
Okay.
Or maybe not. I think there are some clear similarities and some overlap. But conceptually, cottage housing has taken on sort of its own life in terms of a conversation topic in housing issues amongst the Pacific Northwest. And so we thought we'd bring them forward separately, despite the overlap.
Okay, that's, and then the next question, and maybe a comment that'll follow from that, are some of these housing types more amenable to home ownership versus rental? And the reason I was asking that is I think we should try to bias as much as possible towards encouraging home ownership, recognizing that a certain, AMA, that could be really, really hard. But I did read Commissioner Norman's letter that came out a while ago, and there's a lot of benefits to ownership. So if through zoning, through density, we can have units that are more affordable from a purchasing standpoint than not just a renting standpoint, I think that would be good for the community overall. And I said bias, knowing that we can't accomplish everything with, everybody buys everything, right? So that's all.
Josh,
I do think it's.
Go ahead, Elliot.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I do think that some of these types you typically see more frequently in ownership conditions. That does not mean that any of them can't be delivered as either rental or ownership opportunities. There are still misgivings about the development of condominiums in Washington State, and I think some of these types would be, as for sale products, more likely to be delivered as condominiums, and therefore there may not be as much market interest there. But most of them can be delivered as either.
Okay, other comments? Carrie, do you have anything?
Yeah, just a comment. When I'm looking at the maps, I really struggle with where things would go elsewhere outside of town center or a mixed-use center. And I always am brought back to the fact there's just a lot of R1 zoning right in the middle of the city surrounding town center. And I'm always driving through there, and when I'm thinking about ADUs or cottage, I'm always thinking there because there's space on the lot. But then I go back to the map and I see it's R1, so it's not zoned for that right now. So when we talk about other things outside of the centers, I really struggle to figure out like how that would actually work and look.
Josh?
So I wanted to just respond to that, and I think Josh has been raising, an interesting House bill that's under review currently, HB 1110. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I'd suggest Googling it and looking it up and reading what's going on there. There is the potential that the legislature could mandate and basically homogenize zoning in all cities to meet a minimum density. So our R1 would effectively be gone if that is passed. And it would mandate that many of these missing middle housing types that are shown here be allowed by right across the city without design review, with limit on what zoning controls we have to control how they look and feel, on and on. There's a whole host of things. So what I think it's interesting, I almost feel like the legislature is sort of testing us to see if we're going to pass stuff like this that we're looking at. And if we don't, then they're going to just go ahead and just, homogenize all zoning across the state. So I keep that in the back of your mind that, there is this other possible action the state could take. And these conversations are essentially rendered moot if that happens. So we still have some sense of local control. We have a mandate that's pretty significant to accommodate these different types of housing units. And we really got to find some solutions to make that work. If not, then the state's going to step in and just take the next step and homogenize zoning across the entire city.
Josh, go ahead.
David, you just touched on an item I was just going to ask about. On the on item 1, after infrastructure and all the other concerns people have surrounding growth, the biggest heartache I think I hear from people is that, and we tackled this some with development regulations, but that the housing doesn't look and feel like people expected or wanted, or the reason why they moved to Sammamish with that foresty appearance. So on question 1, my question back to you is, can we include some level of design review that goes through the Planning Commission, so that we can ensure that if we're going to have some higher density missing middle housing put into some place, perhaps above and beyond what the zoning is, if we have, like, say, floating or overlay zoning, can we have some controls in place to make sure that it's going to look good, and that we're not, that people who need missing middle housing don't, look like they're in a different part of Sammamish than what a lot of people are.
That's something that I, as a recommendation, we'll carry forward and continue to explore. Even if we did have some level of design review for projects of meaningful scale, right? We're not going to take every new single-family home through the Planning Commission for design review. That would be virtually impossible. Understanding that it still would be criteria based. So whether or not the Planning Commission is involved in some sort of form of design review, or whether it's administrative at the staff level, it would still be consistency with criteria, and it wouldn't be necessarily free-form design review. Design review, as I've experienced it, is always driven on criteria, and then a design review board is really there to help press to identify if there are things that the designers could do better to better meet the criteria. So it's always framed by criteria. It's just a matter of who ultimately is the one who is deciding whether or not it has adequately met the criteria through design they've provided, if that makes sense.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, as a quick note, and based on some of the other work that we're doing throughout the region, there are cities, and Seattle is perhaps chief among them, that are reconsidering their approach to design review because of the impact it appears to be having on housing prices. So sticking to something that is very explicitly criteria-based, as David said, is a good way to circumvent what can be negative price impacts on your housing stock. The more subjective the process is, the more difficult it is to navigate, the greater the potential that it actually drives up the cost of housing.
And I would like to add, there is actually proposed legislation being considered currently on eliminating design review boards because of the barrier mentioned by Elliot. And I know I have that House bill, Senate bill number, and I will send that on to you all, but it is currently being considered at the state level.
So I'm going to go in a different direction and say, thinking about sub-area planning, you do have the opportunity to build design guidelines within those sub-areas. And that's one way to, talk about tree retention and all those considerations that can help shape what the products actually turn out to be on the ground. So it's one opportunity that wouldn't work so much looking at the legislative examples, but it is a solution we could implement in certain specific areas.
Can someone move to extend?
Second.
let's say, and let's say until 9:15. So moved and seconded to extend to 9:15. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you. Okay, where were we? TC, did you have a comment?
No, I was just voting in favor of the motion to extend.
Okay, just checking. It's always nice to see your smiling face on the screen there.
I would like to clarify that is House Bill 1026, and it is looking to require any design review of housing development permit applications to be conducted administratively by local government employees. So.
I guess the takeaway here is just my concern is that we're very careful about whatever regulations we put in place to make sure that these houses fit in to the city, right? Whether it's done by the planning commission or staff or whoever. The reason I mentioned planning commission is because we have to walk among all the residents that, we have, I think, a higher level of perhaps responsibility. I know staff feels very, not to diminish how much you care, but, less likelihood that many of you walk into people at Safeway or something, so.
I will give an example. The town center sub-area has very specific design guidelines, building design guidelines, everything from color to window treatments to the use of awnings and so forth. It goes deeper than what we have in our zones. So it is a tool, like Miriam mentioned, putting some design standards to guide what that development will look like. You'll also want to balance that with affordability and not adversely creating a barrier to getting more affordable housing. So it's always a balance. But again, referring back to what Miriam mentioned, design guidelines are also a really good tool, and I think that is wrapped in with sub-area planning as part of these strategies.
So sub-area planning, that would be separate than what's being asked of in item 3 here with the floating or overlay zoning district? Or
You can apply design guidelines to an overlay district. You can look at that. I mean, there are options, and that would be something we could explore.
Okay.
You could also, for that matter, use sub-area planning not purely for, but to put in place a floating or an overlay district. So if you've got two commercial centers that both have a community business zone, but only one of those two centers was appropriate for these types, then you could use a floating or an overlay zone as appropriate through the sub-area plan, which is geographically confined to only that one commercial center, rather than anywhere that community business zone is located.
So a couple comments from me. First, I'd say I think we actually have examples in Sammamish of a lot of this, or several of these examples of missing middle housing. We just don't have very many, right? In each case, like the live work, we have an example of that. Cottage court, I can think of an example of that. There's quite a few of those. So I think actually there's a lot of opportunity in Sammamish to encourage and maybe create space for a lot of this kind of housing. I would also say that I shouldn't see some more than we have now. I don't know that, I think it's a good strategy for working on diversity of housing. I'm questioning how effective it will be in contributing significantly to the amount of housing affordability that we would get to. I think we need to kind of think through that. If it's tied to some of the other strategies we're talking about, perhaps. But in Sammamish, because so much of it is already built, and unless we're talking about tear down and rebuild, which I don't think we are to any great extent, then, we're going to find niches here and there. In the sub-area planning, we may find a grouping of R1 lots that are together that have been there for 50 years that maybe somebody would consider putting some affordable housing on. We may find little pockets here and there, and those would be good opportunities to provide some diverse housing types. Whether that adds up to anything affordable, I'm not really sure, but I do like the idea of giving some thought to looking at alternatives, especially around the two primary commercial centers along 228th. No questions there, just comment. Anybody else? Okay, Elliot, let's move on to the next one.
We have accessory dwelling units. Of course, you have accessory dwelling units allowed in Sammamish. Currently, my understanding is that there have not been all that many of them produced. We rate the level of effort on this one as medium, as well as the time to implement on medium. So really what this is talking about is changes or adaptations to the existing code surrounding ADUs in Sammamish. And the specific implementation considerations we wanted to flag are the issue of parking requirements. Would reducing or eliminating those requirements be feasible for ADUs specifically? Are owner occupancy requirements or condo restrictions on ADUs impacting the uptake on their development? Because currently I believe they are only allowed as rentals. What would make residents more interested in adding ADUs? This is more of a qualitative question. What information would be helpful that you think would increase the uptake of ADU development? And as a specific intervention, should Sammamish offer things like pre-approved designs for ADUs to eliminate some of the uncertainty and friction surrounding their development?
Who's got a comment about ADUs? We've actually talked about ADUs a lot in the past, but go ahead, Josh.
On number 4, yes, as someone who's dealt with getting permits from the city on a couple of occasions, there's nothing, I would rather do anything else with my time, always. It's a giant headache, and I have to imagine that outside of any other requirements we have, actually having to go through the permitting process is the biggest one. So if we can come up with, I don't know, whatever, pick the pieces and build it, item number 4, I think that would certainly be very helpful. The other questions you have here, I don't really have much input on, but item number 4, I think that's would certainly help.
Anybody else? I will say that I am a bit hesitant about allowing condos, allowing them to be a condoed out. It feels like there's a lot of complications there, and it also, to me, feels like we're cheating the zoning and the density requirements a little bit by allowing somebody to divide their property and put an ADU and condo out the ADU. It just doesn't feel like that's in the spirit of what we're trying to do. Maybe that's just me, but it doesn't feel like it's going to help us get more ADUs or solve any of our problems. I honestly, I'm not exactly sure why we have not generated more accessory dwelling units. I think that some of it may be education. I would also say that I think that a lot of the population in Sammamish now, maybe more than it used to be, is it doesn't have the background of, financing, investing, or construction, or the kinds of things that are more likely to make jumping in the deep end and considering an ADU on your property something that seems viable to people. So in some ways, I think ADUs is a good Lego to add to our effort to build up to 1,400. But we need to help people understand that it's an option, and then make sure that we're doing it the right way. So I'm not sure how to educate people or offer that as a way for them to think about it. I think it's just a barrier of, it sounds like an overwhelming thing for a lot of people to try to take on. So, and it doesn't have to be necessarily, but I can see where it's a barrier, just that hesitation. But I do think it's a good strategy to include. I guess I am curious, so what are we talking about doing here that's different than what we have right now that would encourage more ADU development within the city? Or are we just saying we should talk about trying to figure out ways to encourage more ADUs?
I think it's both. I think I'm hearing from the first 2 comments that there's enough interest in making the ADU program more effective that we should keep talking about ways, even if we haven't surfaced them yet. I'm hearing that as direction thus far. but I also think we've tried to offer a few specific opportunities. The parking requirements are one, the owner occupancy restrictions are another. The idea of trying to make the permitting process more frictionless would be a third. We've also talked about, and it's not on this slide, this has just been a conversation amongst the project team, whether attached and detached ADUs on the same parcel or same property would be appropriate. I think the prevailing attitude was that that might not be one of our primary avenues of investigation, but all of these things I think are considerations that we would look to evaluate.
John, if you had a comment?
With the ADUs, is there any thought of incentivizing or tracking for low income or affordability?
I absolutely think we could do that. Yeah, it's not on the slide, but it's a great suggestion. I think this one clearly hits at housing diversity. It is less often the case that housing units as ADUs directly contribute to housing at those lower levels of affordability, but it very well could be, and that is something the city could track. I suppose I should clarify, they are often delivered as market rate units at levels that are more affordable. Whether or not they hit those 80%, 50%, 30% levels is less clear, and they typically are not offered as subsidized units. And to get those lower levels, such as 30%, you almost always need subsidy. So
I would also think that that would also need to be addressed through the owner occupancy requirement changing as well. Maybe not. Putting it out there as a question to David and Elliot.
Possibly. Another interesting point about ADUs is that they do serve a certain use for affordable housing for people at a certain point in their life when, say someone moves back home and they need a place to live, they're done with college, they're in transition, or at another point in their life, and it happens to fit into that 0% income range where you're not making any money and you need a place to live, and family offers it. I don't know how we would count that. I don't know if we would count that as an affordable unit, or if we would count that as part of the family unit. It's an interesting one, but I'm sure that there are situations in the city where, in Sammamish already, where people have ADUs and they have a family member living in it at a far reduced rent, if any rent.
And I do think we had a really robust conversation with the city council last week about demographic trends that Sammamish is facing, and one of those being an increase in the number of multi-generational households that we're seeing. And that's another type of housing diversity that is within the scope of the housing action plan. It's another identified housing need for Sammamish specifically. So ADUs do check that box with or without meeting the affordability requirements that we've been speaking to.
I guess I would add a comment then that I would be a little cautious also about, and I don't know how the program actually does work or would work, but we've seen a lot of 5,000 plus square foot homes being built based on that multi-generational change within the demographics. And I would not necessarily want to then say, okay, well, if you build out the lower level and create a separate doorway, we'll count that as an ADU. And all we're doing is encouraging more McMansions that are built 5 feet apart. I would want to be very cautious that we don't inadvertently create that situation with any efforts to create more ADUs. Just by designating something an ADU, now we're getting a product that we don't intend. Okay, anybody else?
I've got one.
Go ahead, TC.
So as we're talking about trying to kind of conceptualize or figure out how to place these additional units in, are there any controls in place to ensure that a unit that's sold as affordable continues to remain affordable? I guess where I'm going with this is, how do we prevent someone from buying an affordable unit and then sitting in it for 2 years and selling it at market rate?
Most of these programs where the units are for sale in the first place come with deed restrictions that then require them to be affordable in perpetuity, or at least for very, very long periods of time. I think we spoke to a 50-year time horizon earlier with a certain strategy. In some cases, it's much longer than that, can be 99 years. But almost always there's a deed restriction to ensure that it stays affordable.
And you'll see that I've noticed a few in my neighborhood in the posting itself. Like it says, this is an income restricted home for sale. See this link for qualifications. But it's part, like for us, they're managed by Arch, and it's part of the process that they oversee as well.
Okay, thank you.
I think there was a question of clarification. What is the actual current condo restriction requirements? I think I know, but I may not know what those restrictions are in Sammamish. Can somebody at least give a high-level view of what that says?
That's a challenge I want to describe. So you could do a condo currently through and have separate ownership of units on one parcel in a residential district through a conditional use permit process, which is a fairly cumbersome process. It's almost the same as going through a short subdivision. So you could, in theory, if you had enough density, so say you were in the, I'll just make it really easy, in the R1, and you had 2 acres of property and you wanted to build 2 homes on that property, but not do a subdivision, you would have to go through a conditional use permit process that would allow you to ultimately sell one of the units through a condominium designation. You could, in theory, I guess, do that with ADU as well. I've not seen that happen. I don't know how that exactly would work. However, it's really cumbersome for the product that you get. So what would happen is if you wanted to change the rules, change policy, change the rules to streamline that, we would simply make it an administrative process that if you met certain criteria, that you would be allowed to pursue condominium designation and ultimately create an air condo with commonly owned property and sell the units that could be under separate ownership per the terms of a condominium designation.
What are the owner occupancy requirements identified in question 2 related to ADUs?
We currently have, you have to, if you want to rent your ADU or the primary residence, you have to either live in the ADU or the primary residence.
Okay, so on that part of the question, I would recommend getting rid of that owner occupancy requirement.
So that both of the units could be rented.
Yeah, if the question is how do you increase the uptake of ADUs, if you can have someone who wants to rent the property then increase their revenue by 20% by building an ADU, I think that would increase the uptake if they don't have to live there. If they look at it as purely an investment property, I think that would be one way to do it. And perhaps you layer on that, if you want to do that, then you must hit a certain AMI threshold on one or both of the rentals or something. But I think
that's an idea. Yeah.
The owner occupancy requirement is probably a real limiter on someone who's looking at property as a rental investment.
The other one that's one more step would be to allow for more than one ADU. You know, in Seattle they changed the rules so you could have one ADU and one DADU. So the ADU, according to Seattle's rules, is it's incorporated into the existing residence. It's part of the primary structure. And then the detached accessory dwelling unit is separate from that. So you can have your primary residence an attached accessory dwelling unit and a detached accessory dwelling unit. And I'm curious if there's interest in us further exploring how to make that happen, if that's something that you see as beneficial to seeing more ADUs be built in the city.
Personally, I think so. I think mom and pop rental owners are probably are a great source of housing for people. And if you're giving them the ability to, with low risk, kind of increase the revenue that they can get from the property, that makes a mom and pop purchase of a rental property in Sammamish more viable. Because right now, something in Sammamish just doesn't cash flow for an average investor. So that would make it potentially a viable option for more, mom and pop style rentals.
Yeah, and that is actually another bill being considered at the state level. That would be Senate Bill 5235, allowing a detached and attached ADUs on a parcel and not restricting that. David, another follow-up question. Our code requires ADUs to be registered, correct? So one way of tracking and the idea of having an affordable housing requirement, that could be something that can be monitored and tracked through that registration. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, that's correct. One thing to keep in mind, and this is going to become a point of conversation with Arch, when you look across all the Arch member cities and you look at all the numbers of units that they're being directed by King County countywide planning policy to plan for and accommodate, the administrative operating cost of oversight on these covenants that go, or these deed restrictions, is actually quite high. So Arch will probably see exponential growth in its staffing over the next few years, and we're going to need to think, when we codify a lot of the things we're talking about with some of these housing tools, a way to really get clear data and make sure that we are creating a program where there are not loopholes or things that are missed. So this is all just, this is a rhetorical comment. We're just needing to think about this. So just want to put a pin in that one when we come back and watch this video in a few months, to remember that.
That's your verbal parking lot. Got it. All right, anything else on ADUs? Okay, Elliot, let's move on to the next one.
Tiny homes are up next. High level of effort attributed to this one, medium time to implement. The four considerations are: should tiny homes be an allowed use by right in any zoning designation at all? And if so, where in the city would be appropriate? What kinds of incentives would be appropriate to encourage tiny homes? That presumes that you would say yes to question number one. Should portable tiny homes be allowed as a temporary use if they meet certain criteria? And what other considerations should be taken into account? This is a similar question as we've asked on other strategies in terms of affordability levels, the number of units that are deemed affordable, et cetera.
Elliot, what are we using as a definition of tiny homes for this conversation?
In terms of size, they are typically not larger than 400 square feet. Some of them are mobile, some of them are not. It is the case that they are sometimes co-located on a single parcel. Other times subject to regulations, there may only be one allowed on a given parcel.
So really, we're just talking about housing of a certain size and smaller. That's really mostly what brackets this.
That's correct. And it's an order of magnitude smaller than any of the other types we're talking about this evening.
Sure. Okay. Questions or comments? Mike, go ahead.
I'll jump in. I do think that portable tiny homes, I've seen them. I don't see them as being substantially different than those that are not portable. And if we're encouraging this low-income housing, I don't see why we would put that barrier to say that they shouldn't be, or they must not be portable. So that's an answer to one of the questions, at least.
I think, Mike, one of the things to take into account is a portable tiny home might not have the same type of connectivity for resources like electricity and gas. So they may use more things like propane, like a RV would. And in our last meeting, we talked about how we're going to reduce our carbon emissions and all of those things. So allowing for portable tiny homes could end up having a net negative environmental impact. I hope that made sense.
It actually does, but there's always trade-offs, and I'm looking at the affordability and the number of tiny homes that might show up. So yeah, TC, I certainly recognize that, and it is a concern, but as tiny homes, they also have tiny demands for energy, so.
Yeah, but I think when you start looking at kind of the construction of tiny homes, especially the mobile ones, they may not be using as robust materials as you would get with a typical structure. I think one of the other things I would look at would be what type of duration or what type of turnover we're looking at from a tiny home area where they're mobile, right? How many are going to be kind of coming and going, and what is the impact to that within the traffic flow, right? We're not talking about a semi hauling a large trailer that can move at posted vehicle speeds. A lot of times we're talking about, consumer class vehicles pulling something behind them, and kind of the not road wear, but how that impacts traffic patterns.
John, did you have something?
Sure. So differentiating between permanent structures and mobile. Permanent seems like at the very low end of the middle zoning stuff, that sort of permanent cottage housing could be rolled into that, whether it's an overlay or development agreement or whatever. The mobile stuff is more complicated. I know unincorporated King County was really struggling with this because someone would have a 5-acre lot out there and they'd pull up and plop a mobile home on it. And I don't know if they've resolved it, but the interim solution was they could camp there for 90 days. So it was temporary use. So I think maybe consultant or staff doing a little bit more research on how the mobile stuff is getting regulated and managed or not might help inform our decisions.
I think a lot is being talked about for generating housing. What are all of the folks living in this housing going to do with their time? What jobs are being created to go along with this, right? It's awesome to come up with a plan to bring in a bunch of additional households. What are they going to do with their time?
Carrie, did you have anything? Josh?
I do. Sorry, everybody. As I've been thinking through this, I can see why that dial is moved to high because there's just so many things to consider about this. Just to not that it would be like, we are talking like the tiny homes, 400 square feet, I think is what was mentioned. So these are quite small. Then is there then plumbing requirements that go into this, or is that like the big question mark at this point? Like, are we imagining a tiny home village that has a communal washroom, for example? Is that what's in mind in this instance?
Elliot, do you want to answer that question? I know there are a couple examples that I am familiar with down in Olympia, where it is a tiny home village, where it's like, a bunch of tiny homes around a courtyard that has a common like community building where there's, washing facilities, a kitchen, and common open space. And then the tiny home itself has a bedroom, a restroom, a small kitchen, and a very small living space. Those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, but maybe you can speak to this one a little bit more.
I don't know that I have specific examples in the same way you do, Kelly, and I appreciate those. I do think that there are different models being employed, and I think that probably in parallel, there are different affordability levels being hit. So the model in Olympia is probably targeting the 30% or the 50% of AMI. And if you took a version of this forward that was not focused on the sort of tiny home court or tiny home community, but rather just allowing tiny homes by right in certain areas, even subject to certain plumbing requirements, maybe that's a strategy more geared toward something like the 80% AMI level. I know that it's been done both of those ways. I don't believe that we as a project team had envisioned the tiny home community or court as the primary avenue of implementation for Sammamish, but I'm happy to be challenged on that front by anyone who feels otherwise.
Well, as I'm thinking through, I just want to get an idea of what was in someone's mind's eye when this was written down or tossed out as an idea. So then, how then would these be different than, say, a DADU?
In many cases, they could be very similar. I believe a tiny home may be allowed as a DADU under certain circumstances. We're probably talking about these being allowed by right on their own parcel, and maybe by extension we scale up that conversation to talk about multiple being allowed on a single parcel with some shared amenities. I think that's something where we'd be looking for Planning Commission feedback or direction. I will just say in response, Commissioner, to the first part of your question about why this was elevated in the first place, this had pretty high traction at our community event in December and the subsequent survey that we circulated as a means of encouraging workforce housing. So something where individuals who are working in Sammamish jobs currently but can't afford to live in Sammamish might be able to find a housing opportunity locally. And it was one of the highest rated of the strategies that were showcased at that particular event. So that's part of the thinking as to why it's been advanced here.
Okay. So before I say this, I'm not on its face opposed to this idea, but I'm curious if the people who said tiny homes are a good idea for workforce housing, were these the people who were potentially living in those houses, or were these people trying to figure out a solution for somebody working at Safeway or something? Who was saying that it's a good idea for workforce housing? The person living in it, or someone thinking it would be a good idea for someone? So I'm curious if there really would be uptake by someone who works at Safeway or not. So you might not have an answer for me, and that's fine. But what comes to mind with something like this is allowing a church to have a set of tiny homes on their property because they want to offer a service and provide really low AMI or even no income options for people. That's what comes to mind when I'm thinking of tiny homes, not necessarily a bunch of tiny homes on, a half acre. That's not what came to mind when I thought of it. If at the same time, my concern with, something like that is in Sammamish, we don't have a lot of transit options. We don't have a lot of services. So that becomes a challenge that I guess the church would have to figure out. But that's what I think of when I think of how these might be used in Sammamish. I don't know who would. Do we have an understanding in other areas of who's living in there? Do they have vehicles? Are there other cities like Sammamish that have these in place so we can understand, like, what are the other barriers that go in place in having
I think we need to do a little more research on that. Just trying to understand where you would envision, as the commission members, the feedback on where you envision these fitting in is helpful. For example, tiny homes, I've seen them in my community built in, someone has a large backyard and they allow somebody to place a tiny home there for a period of time. And it's put on some sonotube concrete foundations and it could be moved, or it's portable. It could also be in a type of an environment that Kelly described, where it's basically I don't want to say this because I think there's a bad connotation attached to it, but it's a trailer park of the past. There was it was a common type of housing, and you still see it all over Southern California, where you have trailer parks, and a lot of those trailer parks have rebranded as tiny home parks, and many of the prefab trailers have disappeared, and now you see tiny homes popping up where those prefab trailers were. So it's really providing and there are many people that really find value in a simple lifestyle, that want to live in a small home, that like to have access to a job nearby. And, I think it's something that could be seen as workforce housing for somebody in the right situation, right? The right point in their life with the right factors around them.
And I do want to add, when you're, talking about 0 to 30% AMI, there's going to be a lot of tools thrown at getting that type of housing. And so tiny homes is one of those options, as many others that we have discussed today. So it just, again, it provides another tool in the toolbox on how to accommodate and report out on that accommodation, that we are serious about 0 to 30% AMI.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Kelly, I think that was a really important point. And as I've thought about this, we will need these tools. And so tiny houses are among the cheapest, least expensive ways to get that lower affordability range. And I've also noted in the feedback from the surveys and so forth that there's not a lot of energy around subsidies, taxes, those sorts of things. So how do we do it without taxes? Tiny homes is an option. And I can't imagine there being a lot. We wouldn't want that in Sammamish, but helping to fill some of the need. And as far as the portability, the ones actually that I've seen have essentially acted like an ADU, a detached ADU, where it was literally rolled up into the backyard. It was there for 2 years. The person was in it, moved on to another job or whatever. It was essentially an ADU in terms of how things worked. And they connect, I think one of them connected up to the house, for electricity and all that. So I think as we work through this, understanding how close we can get in terms of meeting our targets for the 30% AMI, and how all the various tools match, will give us a sense of what role tiny houses can play. And I can't imagine not having to play some role. Otherwise, we just can't meet that goal. So it's going to take some research, some understanding, playing around with the areas where they might be able to be placed, whether they could be a substitute for an ADU or defined as one. Options like what Commissioner Amato mentioned about with the various institutions that might be able to make that as part of their charitable giving or whatever, and opening up the possibilities for letting that happen. So just the tools in the toolkit, right? So thank you.
So I'm going to be a bit more blunt, maybe get myself in trouble, but I think when it comes to tiny houses, if we're talking about the kind you see on HGTV, that people tour and think they're beautiful, and yeah, I think everybody probably is pretty much in favor of that. But I have to say that I think I and other probably members of the community have concerns that pretty soon a burned out RV gets rolled up in somebody's backyard and designated as a tiny house. And that cannot happen. That the community will not accept that. So someplace in between there, if we want to consider tiny houses as part of our strategy, we need to be thoughtful about designating what the requirements are to get a permit for a tiny house. So people can't just call whatever they want a tiny house and roll it in there and burn their garbage in a bin in the back and dump their sewage out the side door. And I mean, I'm being dramatic, but that's the idea, right? That people's minds go pretty quickly to that potential. So as long as tiny houses have some criteria, get a permit, have some utility connections, have a plan, nothing too overburdensome, but you know, you got to actually have some kind of a plan on what you're going to do. I think most people would support it, and it's a good tool, as Mike said. But let's be careful. People will have questions. I have questions about how that could be taken advantage of, so let's be careful. Okay, let's move on to the next one, Elliot.
This is the Housing Repair, Modification, and Preservation Program. We state that it's a program, although it certainly hasn't been designed yet. It ranks as a high level of effort and a long time to implement, largely because it would require quite a bit of staff time or staff resources on an ongoing basis to administer the program, and it probably requires a fair number of dollars to go with it. That being said, it is a question, and it is question number one in implementation considerations, whether or not this program, should you design it, would focus on technical assistance or financial support or something else. So in other words, help in designing modifications to a home to allow for aging in place, or actual funding for those modifications. And then what tools can the city develop, or maybe what components of this hypothetical program would help to mitigate or minimize displacement?
I'm going to start on my left. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Mike.
we'll go to, I saw this and I was wondering how it helps meet the goals that were stated at the beginning around increasing diversity of housing types or affordability. So help me understand that.
I think it's more obliquely related to affordability and more directly related to diversity. In terms of diversity of housing types, we can talk about it really discreetly as single family detached, single family attached, you know, quadplex, whatever, on down the line to multifamily. But I think there are gray areas or gradations in there that are important to take into account. So to use the example of a multi-generational family per our conversation with City Council last week, it may be a single family detached home on the outside, but the interior configuration of that space can make a major difference in terms of its appropriateness for different family types. And so that's a different type of diversity that may not be as obvious from the outside, but it's diversity nonetheless, and it responds to demographic trends affecting Sammamish. I do think it can have an impact on affordability. If you think about college students returning home and what their income might support in terms of housing costs, or you know, retirees who want to stay in a home with their family, and you know, what sort of affordability considerations that presents. I think this strategy is in the mix on those fronts, but probably less central to the affordability conversation.
Okay, and that, so that might have. Well, let me. So I might have not fully appreciated the modifications. So part of this would be, in some ways, supporting a resident who may want to modify their house in some way to allow multi-generational families. Is that versus fix the roof kind of repair?
Or just for aging in place. So we think about modifications to a home to facilitate home health care. That would be potentially in the mix here. I do think the fix the roof types of repairs could also potentially be in the mix. And the relationship there with affordability is that if you can keep older homes in habitable condition, then those homes naturally are going to be more affordable than brand new homes. And so it allows your housing stock to be more enduring in a way that might create some naturally occurring or market rate affordable housing, as opposed to subsidized affordable housing.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of costs it would be and the controls and who gets the benefit of this and all. I could see why, as Josh said on one of these earlier, why the level of effort would be high to define all of this. And I do wonder if it would have sufficient enough impact on the goals for the Housing Action Plan. So some work that needs to be, fleshed out over there. Thank you.
I wanted to just add one thing. One component of the grant that isn't the primary focus, but it is a focus, was around anti-displacement. And we've talked a lot about that as a planning commission, and we hear it with city council and residents, right? People who can't afford to stay here, whether it's due to increasing property taxes or just the property taxes being so high that it forces them to not make necessary repairs. And so this is a response to some of that as well.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, so as Mike said, I see this as more of an implementation and not a core piece of the comp plan. That said, in the past, I've participated twice with the Christmas in April program here in Sammamish, where the whole crew goes in and does a bunch of work on a home that's overgrown or needs repair. So there's definitely a need for that. We do have housing stock from the 50s and 60s, or in my case, much older. So, this would be a desirable policy, but big budget consideration for the council. The city of Bellevue has a very extensive program that they could look at, and David would be pretty familiar with that. So, desirable, yes. Probably not. I don't know if we'd include something to this degree in the comp plan.
Go ahead, Carrie.
Sure. This one spoke to me, as the others did too, just from reading the responses and really understanding the multi-generational that is happening in some of the larger homes. I know when I bought my home here, it was on its way to being modified in not very well, and so we had to undo that modification. So one suggestion, maybe, if this was the intent, I definitely could see how, we have a tri-level, making that lower level a place where home health care could live, or a parent or something like that. Maybe making the permit process a little bit easier on that. So that's one sort of tool to help, maybe not financial assistance with the actual changes, but helping with the permit, with the understanding of we're not trying to just squeeze more, because on the permit it asks if you're like increasing number of like drain lines or whatever, that it wouldn't raise a flag. It would be like, oh, they're probably doing this because they're trying to address this kind of situation. So permitting help might be good.
Go ahead, Josh.
How is this different than the King County housing repair program that they have?
I'm not sure that I'm prepared to answer that question. Happy to defer, and if we don't have a good answer, we can come back with one after some research.
I think part of it depends on, I guess, the vision for the program that would be developed. But from my perspective, we wouldn't necessarily be duplicating it, but kind of acting as a bridge to different resources. So finding out, what the customer needs, and then trying to connect them to resources either externally or services internally to help meet those specific needs, if that makes sense.
So it does. One of the challenges I found with King County's program is they have income limitations or requirements that I think probably far exceed a lot of people in Sammamish who even still would need help from that sort of program. So we've got the level of effort high and the time to implement high. I'm just curious if there's a way to essentially piggyback on their program they have already. They already administer it. They already have the administrative costs that go into that. Could we just hand them money that they then hand back to Sammamish residents at a different income threshold or different requirement level that we kind of help, maybe facilitate, but we don't create our own program, but use theirs to kind of be the shell for what we do for Sammamish residents, because they provide a lot of the same things, whether it's low-cost loans for a roof repair, or even just installing grab bars or a ramp to enable someone to age in place. That's the point of the program. But I don't think it works for Sammamish. But could we explore that being an easier method or a quicker method of implementing something like this?
That sounds like a great conversation that we should, now that we have it record, move into the partnership conversation that we'll have shortly.
Please don't kill the messenger. Would somebody move to extend the meeting?
Move to extend to 9:35.
Second, somebody want to second that? It's been moved and seconded to extend 9:35. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you. TC, did you have comment on this one?
Nope.
So then my one direct comment kind of for staff and everyone is, frankly, I think this is something we should just be doing anyway. If we can fold it in as part of a housing strategy, great. But the idea that as a community, we can particularly help those who've been often long-time community members, contributed to the community. This is a case of doing the right thing, and really we should find a way to do it. And there's actually a lot of people that volunteer for some of this kind of stuff, or commercial organizations that are willing to help. And if we can just be a facilitator for that, I think if it helps our housing action plan, great. If it doesn't, it's still the right thing to do, and we should be doing it. Okay, Elliot, next. Please.
Cottage housing. We're treading some familiar ground here, so if we make quick work of this one, fantastic. We've got level of effort medium, time to implement medium. Again, we want to know about which areas or zoning districts are best suited to cottage housing, what other barriers to development of cottage housing exist that the city can address, and then we have some specific dimensional considerations, which we can get into if you feel like they're primed for conversation, and otherwise we can take back and do some more design work for you on.
Okay, comments? Josh looks like he has one.
I'm a big fan of cottage housing. I think they fit what we're looking to do quite well, and they fit what people might envision Sammamish looks like. I'm hard-pressed to think of an area where it should be disallowed, and I've spent 30 seconds thinking about it, so that's not very helpful. But I think they're definitely, I don't know how you calculate a FAR on this, or FAR. I don't know if you pronounce it or not. But so cottage housing, if you could go into it a little bit more, you have, say, can you define how you end up with what would be considered that cottage housing on a parcel, and then how you can then determine what the FAR, or is it pronounced, do I say it, or do I? FAR, okay. How would you determine that? I mean, on a single family home, it's super simple, but on this, I'm not even beginning to figure it out.
I could take that one. It would be calculated across the entire site. So what you would be doing is most, and this presents another question, I think, that is really right-sizing the permit process to allow for cottage housing development to occur. Currently, or more recently, we had a cottage housing pilot program that we could pretty easily bring back into our code on a permanent basis. And my sense is that the permit process that went along with that was a little bit of an obstruction to being successful with the program. So we might want to consider dialing back the permit process a little bit. But with regard to so most cottage housing is developed sort of in a campus style, or on an overall site through more cohesive design, how it fits together, the amenities that are provided, landscaping, et cetera. And floor to area ratio would be measured across the entire site. And what that would mean is that the designer would have to give and take with the designs of the various cottages that are going onto the site, and not exceed the maximum FAR that's allowed for the site.
Thank you.
Anybody else? My comment would be that I think that cottage housing, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which the name, is sort of desirable to people. They like the idea, they like the concept, and there's some nice pictures out there of it. I do think we have to be thoughtful about how it gets actually implemented so that we don't have, traffic issues right nearby the development where everybody's going in and out of one drive and causing problems. Just, there's a lot of things that go with it which are naturally part of the development process anyway. But I would hope we wouldn't get too blinded by the idea of cottage housing being a magic solution, because it's probably a bit more dense than single-family homes, but it's not really getting at creating tons of affordable housing in the city either. So, yeah, another Lego to add to the structure, but at the extent to which it's really going to contribute to 1,400, I'm not convinced it'll be a big part of it, but it sounds nice.
And I will say cottage housing is allowed in the town center, and there are design requirements that go along with it. I will also say we do not have any development applications that are proposing cottage housing at this time. So.
Okay, anything else on cottage housing? Elliot, let's move on to partnerships.
Partnerships. This is, of course, something you are already engaged in. I think there we go. But there may be some gaps in the partnerships that you currently have or ways that you could invest further in your partnerships. This is determined to be a low level of effort and a short time to implement, in large part because it's already part of staff's work program where it's part of ongoing work. The specific implementation considerations: are there housing issues in Sammamish that would benefit from or are not currently adequately supported by robust partnerships? And are there any particular types of partnerships where the city of Sammamish is well positioned to be more of a regional leader on these issues than maybe it has been in the past?
Can we define partnerships to the extent that, I know in the notes it talks about Arch, but who else? What else does this look like?
I don't know that I'm in the best position here on the call to speak to your existing partnerships, but I think we've talked about or implied several here in this conversation tonight. We talked about piggybacking on the King County program for housing modifications as an example. I'm happy to defer to others who have some concrete examples.
I also think we also talked about review of our TDR program, which is heavily reliant on a partnership through interlocal agreement with King County. So there's that. We also could look at partnerships with the districts, the school districts, the utility districts who own property that could be TDR sending sites. Also could be TDR receiving sites. I know that the Water and Sewer District attended one of our housing meetings that we had. Lloyd Warren, who's one of the board members there, and who indicated he was authorized to speak on behalf of the board, the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District, and they were very interested in workforce housing and in partnering with the city to work on workforce housing. I do know that they own a piece of property right there in front of the water tower that is not developed and would be a great location to put some workforce housing. So those are the types of things that we would continue to pursue and expand on. It's also partnerships with Microsoft, for example, if there's any grant funding available. It's partnerships with other cities to build projects, say Issaquah to the south or Redmond to the north, and we had opportunity to somehow partner with them on that. It's really looking widely and presenting a strong policy base, first through the Housing Action Plan and then through the Comprehensive Plan, that gives us direction to keep hunting for really beneficial partnerships and to continue to grow those and maintain those partnerships, because there's a lot of, once you set them up, there's a lot of maintenance that goes into those as well.
I think so in my previous work, we worked with a dedicated planner who worked with the local housing authority and nonprofits, and together we all worked as kind of a consortium to go after funding for affordable housing or for supportive services. So I think there's a wide range of what partnerships could look like. And I think a lot of it depends on your staffing capacity and what you choose to dedicate to this area as well. So while we've put it as level of effort low and time to implement short, I think depending on how we define it and what we're looking for, that could get adjusted to medium as well.
Just a quick shout out to a few more because they were stakeholders and participants in this planning process. We engaged 3 potential partners in this project: Issaquah Community Services, Habitat for Humanity, and Imagine Housing, a nonprofit home builder. So 3 additional data points.
And then I would like to add to that, Elliot, and you have it up there on the slide with sample cities, is the Low Income Housing Institute, which is a nonprofit developer. And they have developed 10 tiny home villages here in the Puget Sound. So looking at nonprofits who maybe have experience with specific housing types too, we should probably investigate.
So just to be slightly contrarian on this otherwise rosy topic, all of those are existing, would be my general perception, and yet we've not really produced any affordable housing or very limited affordable housing in the city. So I struggle to see as a topic, are we changing our relationship with those existing partnerships? Or, and this is an idea I have, it's possible that because of the requirements for housing affordability that are going to likely be imposed on all of us as cities, there may be new agencies, new groups, somebody new that emerges to try to help support communities with this. And I think we should definitely be on the lookout for that. But relying on the same thing to produce different results, I guess I'm struggling to see what we're going to do different that would produce different results than what we've experienced to date.
I think it would need to be a dedicated work plan item, in my opinion. I think one of the big challenges we have is capacity, right? We only have so much time in the day to do so much work. And so it would need dedicated staff, or at least, a portion of their job would be to come out and develop and maintain partnerships and grow partnerships with specific goals and deliverables.
And I also think it takes policy direction directly implanted in the comprehensive plan to help us reframe those relationships within those partnerships and what the city's role is. The city, admittedly, just having lived that experience for a while now, is kind of in the back seat in most of those partnerships, and is kind of a silent partner. We're there, we're going through the motions, and we're doing, we're participating, but we don't have a clear charge, and we don't have clear direction on what we should be doing. We don't have budget assignment. We don't have a lot of the things that other cities have to be a productive, dominant partner in those relationships. So the first place I would go is changing and focusing on changing policy language to direct us going forward. Then we can start to evaluate how to ramp up programs like Miriam's talking about, how we could get budget allocation carved out, because it is directed in the comprehensive plan that we take on that type of role.
I also just would say that I think we should be eyes wide open and recognize that many of those agencies are going to be overwhelmed with all of us deciding to do exactly the same thing to them. So we need to think about that as well. Josh, did you have a comment?
On item number 2, I'm curious, you just mentioned how we're backseat and not doing, I'm just curious, what is not happening that should be happening? And what do you see Sammamish potentially being uniquely positioned to be a leader on, given what you know about budget, staff capacity, and things like that?
Yeah, so Sammamish could, and we have opportunity. We will have more opportunity to pursue things like development agreements that engage Arch and possibly bring to the table some projects for the Arch, for application of Arch Trust Fund dollars. We haven't been a recipient of Arch Trust Fund dollars. I think the Habitat Project was recipient. Is that correct, Miriam? Do you recall? So we do have that, but however, there are dollars available through the Arch Trust Fund process, and we would need to cultivate projects to get to that point where they become recipients. Other cities do that and support that. Another example is with the recent bill that dedicated a certain percentage of retail sales tax to housing and I guess transitional housing and emergency housing, that the city opted not to take the full share, so it was defaulted to King County. Cities like Issaquah and Bellevue did end up voting and passing an ordinance to take their share of those tax funds, and they do now have that in their list of resources to use. We are having a meeting with King County here coming up fairly soon to understand where those dollars are being spent, because 25%, I think, or 30% of those dollars are supposed to be spent back in Sammamish by King County. So we're trying to get a handle on where those are being spent, and also how we will be seen as credited. What sort of credit will go back to Sammamish through all of the accounting regarding housing and housing production and affordability. If that made any sense. We're trying to get an understanding of the relationship there. If those are tax dollars that are coming from Sammamish, how does Sammamish get credit for those dollars when they ultimately get expended? There are other ways for the city to become more engaged in some of the King County Regional Homeless Authority. There's just things we could do that we don't have staffing to take on, and we don't have dedicated funding and resources, and don't have program direction through policy where it helps serve as sort of a touchstone or guiding light for us to continue to pursue.
I also think as a city that has so many opportunities here, we have a lot of room to be creative and be a leader when it comes to like looking at, for example, how green building could have combined with affordable housing, and look at addressing health disparities and things like that. I think the fact that we have really high quality schools here makes it a really nice place to look at how we can link affordable housing with quality education for families that are low income. So I think there's opportunities where we could do some really unique, exciting things and show, be a leader and show innovation in a way that we haven't done yet.
Those were a lot of good thoughts. And what I had was, if you're looking for Sammamish to be a leader in areas, we've got Amazon, Microsoft, T-Mobile, and a lot of their employees live in Sammamish, and workforce housing is brought up by a lot of people often. And I think we've got probably unpopular with the public, but options for, I think, an additional REIT that we can take for affordable housing, maybe. Anyway, what I'm getting to is potentially working with them to establish matching funds for the acquisition of property and development of workforce housing. So if we're looking for ways to establish new partnerships, that might be one of them, because all of their high-paid employees definitely need the support of everyone else who provides the necessary services that they receive. So I think it's a good story to take to them, and something that I know Amazon and Microsoft are both dedicating a lot of money to trying to solve. So just
and that's a timely comment, because I just received communication from Arch that the Housing Development Consortium is looking for sponsor cities to help them pursue the bill regarding REIT 2, the REIT amendment. So that's something that we have been looking at as an alternative funding source. So there'll be more information on that coming soon. But they're asking if, by way of Arch, if the city of Sammamish or other cities on the east side, they're inviting other cities equally, want to take a lead part in advocating for those changes to the REIT structure.
Any other comments?
Just a quick one. I see in the strategy overview about the City of Lacey, a partnership with Low Income Housing Institute. I also noticed in all of the strategies that were listed, there are not-for-profit builders, and I had wondered if that would not be one that would bubble up to a little bit higher priority, or if it's part of this partnership one.
Yeah,
I believe.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Miriam.
I was going to say, I believe that we did include it as an example of one of the partnerships that could be developed here.
Thank you.
If you feel like it, yes.
I move that we extend our meeting to 9:45, hard stop.
We won't be able to get public comment in, so let's extend more than that. Let's extend to 10 o'clock, and then we won't have to do this again. Okay, can somebody second that?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to extend to 10. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you. I think we can move on from partnerships to our last really small topic, sub-area planning. This could take another 2 hours.
I also
let's
wish
try
I could
not
say
to.
it was. I also wish I could say it was the last one. I think we have one more after this one, but
Okay.
we'll go as quickly as we can. Sub-area planning is a big one, and we have purposefully included several different tools and strategies that were initially broken out in this one because we think they can be used to greater effect together. As a result, the level of effort and the time to implement are high and long, but are there any planning activities or processes that you believe are needed for successful sub-area planning that have not already been included or discussed as part of these other tools? And maybe, I think most importantly, or more importantly, which areas in Sammamish are most in need of or best suited to sub-area planning?
Who would like to go first? Carrie.
I have a question. So is this like another town center, like of maybe not of that scale, but is it like making a whole nother area to do something? Is that the gist of this?
I think that's fair. It need not be at the same scale, but yes, you would geographically delineate an area. And town center involved the wholesale creation of new zoning designations, which is not necessary for a sub-area plan, but there would be a lot of similarities, I think, between those processes.
Yeah, so I wouldn't like rule it out, but I'm just not sure, we're not fully fulfilling the ones that we've already done. And so this one, I'm a little confused as it being a priority.
Josh?
So if we're thinking about areas that can easily accept, and we have to accept more growth, the areas that I think we should look at first, even though it takes a lot of effort and time to implement, would be the acres and acres of impervious surface by Englewood Hill Road and 228th. Those are, the environmental impact would be, I mean, I can't imagine, you're not going to end up with any more stormwater runoff than what you have now. You would probably end up with a better result, actually. And if you're looking for something walkable, that place is actually flat. So that, to me, that seems like a prime area, along with Klahani. Klahani, you've got Issaquah Falls City Road that was just redone. There's absolutely no waiting now with those roundabouts. I live there. I use them all the time. For the most part, I love them. I mean, so I would say Klahani, and I can't remember the two that are right across from each other by 228th and Englewood Hill Road. But that's what I think would be a good place to do it. And I think that should be the focus first if we're looking at like all these middle housing options. That to me seems like a prime option.
I will just clarify quickly, part of the reason why this got elevated despite the hurdles to implementation is that there was significant conversation and I think support for, at the level of the city council, really focusing on targeted areas for either increasing density or concentrating growth. And in particular, areas where you do already have the impervious space and you do have the infrastructure in place, and sub-area planning responds to that quite directly, it also can be a vehicle for doing some of the other things that we've talked about, like design guidelines, like overlay zones and things of that nature. So it's a big topic, but it can be quite powerful in that regard.
Mike, anything? Nope. John?
I'm with Josh on going after the commercial areas. We've got one more small one down on East Lake Sammamish Parkway.
TC?
Nothing for me.
So I'll go ahead then and say that my perception of this is, and it's been talked about in the past and received some pretty cold reception in some instances. I do think that this is an inevitability for the city. Whether this is part of what we do now or if we do it 5 years from now or 10 years from now, I think that this level of sub-area planning for Inglewood Plaza, for the QFC area, which has a commercial zone and has some, open space there. The secondary one is the old 7-Eleven, the one down by the lake, and then perhaps Klahani. Those are obvious areas that we should put some energy into having a more detailed plan and try to utilize those better, both from an environmental standpoint, like Josh suggested, but probably from a housing and density standpoint as well. And it really is kind of the next step. And I hesitate in this because I know people don't like the idea, but Town Center largely was a strategy to concentrate growth in a location that then preserved other neighborhoods in the community. And the obvious next step is to either grow Town Center further or to focus on these commercial areas. That's why I believe that as the pressure to increase housing across the region grows, this level of planning and sorting out some of the details around these commercial centers is just an inevitable thing that the city is going to have to do. So yeah, long time to implement, level of effort high. It might be over 20 years, so that wouldn't surprise me at all. I just think that it's inevitable, and so we should probably just get started. Carrie, go ahead.
Okay, so you guys clarified some things. So this is really more a lot of the mixed use area that has been talking about. Okay, I was just envisioning like if there were like in addition to that other areas in the city. And so that, I support, and I think it ties into the last topic, which is like the minimum densities, which I think kind of goes, in my mind, goes with this one a little bit.
Anyone else? Everybody's getting worn down. Okay, Elliot, last one, right?
Last one, minimum densities. We've got some tables there to aid the conversation if helpful. We rated this as a medium level of effort and a medium time to implement, but this really would just make sure that you're not only regulating maximum densities, you're also requiring the development on a given parcel or in a given zoning designation hit some threshold that is determined to be the minimum. The implementation considerations, what zoning districts in your view are currently underutilized or aren't producing the type of housing envisioned? And for those that you do identify as a response to number one, are the current minimum or maximum densities more problematic? So we titled this minimum densities, but directionally, we want to know if we should be investigating one or the other or both.
Questions on minimum densities? John?
So this seems like pretty technical issue involving the future land use map, and I don't know that we can give, or I could give decent feedback tonight without sort of more comprehensive background in terms of capacity. If we're going to come in with overlay or sub-area planning for commercial or multi-use area, the maximum you have here is 18 per acre, 18 units per acre. Is that the right number? I have no idea, so I can't respond.
Josh?
I'm generally opposed to setting minimum density requirements. I know that there's certainly underutilized areas in Sammamish. I don't like the idea of us mandating the change. So if you're looking for direction, I don't love it.
Go ahead, Carrie.
I thought it would be useful more for the commercial areas. So I'm not sure if they would see that as a hindrance, but it might give them a push in the direction of thinking about redeveloping, and maybe it would be like, ooh, and that's good, and maybe they would do something sooner versus later. So, but yeah, I agree. For other parts, maybe not so much.
I have a question that maybe an add-on question here is, how do you feel about a minimum or a mandatory mixture of unit types by zone? And what I mean by that is, traditionally we've seen single-family homes built in single-family zones, but there is a big push at the state level, and we're seeing it across the region, to implement middle housing. We already have many middle housing types allowed in our code. They're just not being built. How do you react to a requirement that, you know, if you are to develop a property, that a certain percentage of unit types be within the category of missing middle?
Well, I don't know if this is a fair comparison, but Issaquah Highlands seems like it has that kind of mix. And maybe it's in like little areas where they define cottage style housing or whatever, but you have quite a lot of mix, and it looks great, and it meets a lot of different requirements. So if that's a reasonable model, then, you know, moving away from sort of the incentives or the I don't know, the obvious, like, oh, this is what we're going to do, is it's just going to be single-family homes in R4 and allow for more of a mix, like the middle housing zone. It seems like it would actually, in some ways, potentially enhance while meeting some of the needs for the types of lower-cost housing that we're hoping to accomplish. So to answer your question, yes, I think it would be beneficial, and we should see if there are ways that it would make it work out well.
My comment here is that I think two things. One, when we restrict someone from using their property the way that they have the right to use their property, we call it a taking. And I sort of feel like when we tell somebody they have to do something with their property, it's inching towards that same thing in the opposite direction. So I'm pretty cautious about how we approach this. And if you look at this table, to me, as a dashboard management tool, without thinking about the practicalities on the ground, literally, you know, R4, R1, those aren't delivering a ton of housing really anyway, especially now that a lot of it's being developed. The R8s and above have designations for minimum density already. I don't know how they're, you know, generally doing and how they actually live up to that. The R6 is the one area where you kind of go, well, you know, if it's zoned R6, that the intent is for there to be some houses, something built on that property. And so that might be one area to think about. However, again, I really struggle with the idea that we would tell somebody how to use their property, because it sounds good from sitting here at the dais, but if it was me and I owned a 3-horse acre designated as R4 and I want to build a house and keep my barn and my horses, I don't want anybody telling me what I got to do with it. As long as I'm not overbuilding it. So I don't know, I really struggle with how this is a practical tool in the city of Sammamish, since we already have minimum densities for some of the higher density zones anyway.
David, on your last question, was that related to development where you mandate certain types of housing, missing middle housing? Were you thinking of that in the R1 through R6 or the R zones? in particular?
Yeah, all the way up through R8, really. And really, that was kind of a middle ground question. Is if we're considering minimum densities, and say minimum densities were found not to be desirable in those zones, well, is a minimum blend requirement of housing types acceptable? So that if you were building a 10-unit development, that 30% of the units or 3 of the units needed to be in the form of missing middle housing types.
I guess I would be more supportive of offering a bonus density on that front rather than mandating that somebody, I mean, a builder's going to look at this and make a decision about what's marketable for the area. And so I don't think on a blanket basis, I don't love the idea on a blanket basis, but offering it as an incentive, I mean, if they can sell more units by doing that, that might make sense, but I don't love mandating it.
And the reason why I asked this question, and one thing to keep in the back of your mind is, based on the numbers that I anticipate being passed down to us through King County adoption of an amendment to King County countywide planning policies, is we're going to be told that we're supposed to be building 0 units in the 80% and above income brackets. So, keeping that in mind, we're going to continuously need to find ways to turn the dials and move the levers to promote or mandate missing middle and below type housing.
Yep, we need lots of Lego pieces for this project. Anybody have any other comments on minimum densities? I think that's it. So, Elliot, anything to wrap up or anything final to discuss? Did I forget anything that we're going to talk about?
We've got a slide with some additional questions, but to everyone's relief, I think we've already covered those questions quite thoroughly. So no, I appreciate the time and the patience, the feedback, and that's all I have for you tonight.
I would say this is a pretty big topic, and as you can tell by the participation level here, it takes a lot of thought and a lot of brain power. So I appreciate, Elliot, you're hanging in here with us and the staff who've participated here. And I know we're going to continue this conversation. It's important to the community, and it's a big topic. So thanks for everybody and their efforts and hanging in there tonight.
Looking forward to continuing it. Thank you all.
Okay. Let's move on to to agenda-related public comment. So now we can do agenda-related public comment for this evening. Remember, 7 minutes per person. Looks like Mary's getting ready to go first.
Good evening again, Mary Wichter, Sammamish. Thanks for all the participation, especially the ideas from TC and from Josh. You guys are doing a great job in thinking of so many things, and all the other people. I'm just going to try to reverse comment here on the things that have been done. David Pyle asked about a mix of houses being regulated, and I will say I think that's probably going to need to happen. If you drive in Duval on Big Rock Road, I think it's a Toll Brothers. They're kind of blue and black, and they have triplexes, quads, they have duplexes front and back, and they really just look like big single-family homes, and the tris and quads are a level higher, but I think it's a really good mix of things, and I think when people start seeing that, they will get that it works. I don't think people can afford the single-family home anymore because the prices are so high, so if you're going to duplexes can often just look like a single-family home. It just looks like a large one. It just has 2 doors somewhere, and I think you don't always need to have your front door to a street, because in the summertime you want to leave that door open. You don't want people walking in and having side doors and things. I think is important. There's a great cottage example on 132nd when you're driving from Redmond up to Kirkland. It's actually in Redmond on the side. There's also some Kirkland bungalows in there that I've done slides on before that I think are very suitable for the lower level things. I think in general cottage housing, you're getting small single story units or 1.5 story units, and you're not getting enough levels that we need to really have to get the number of units that are going to be needed. I do agree with the sub areas, kind of what I think everyone said. I think sub areas are hard to do quickly. I do believe that there's some overlay areas in Redmond. I had read that a couple years ago, and I will look that up again. For REITs, which is real estate excise tax, public comment on that was like, no, don't tax us more. But what I don't think they understand is REITs are paid by the people that are selling the home. So when they sell the home, you get that extra % to help the community. So I think they are worthwhile. And thank you, Josh, for bringing it up and for David talking about it a little bit. I don't think we have enough staff to work on the partnerships, but I like the things that Miriam had said. And then no one has mentioned manufactured homes. Do they have a place in our city? One of the reasons you use manufactured homes is they can really look like duplexes or other single-family homes. They're cheaper to build, and I think it would help with affordability. Also, twice I made a little sound on my phone. I was trying to look it up, and I didn't know it'd play, but it's a thing called Exploring Passive House Design. So it's like 90% energy efficient, and they talk about thermal bridges. And when you start doing that, you don't want to have things that butt out in places where the heat can get lost, so you're going to change the architecture design. So I don't think we should go through and put on things to say, hey, you have to look like this or do this, because that's one of the things that changes energy efficiency, and it makes affordability, makes the permitting longer, and then you have to do it to criteria and not be so subjective. I think Josh had asked about owner-occupied houses for the ADUs and or tiny homes. I think tiny homes could be implemented as a subset of ADUs. And then in the other cities, particularly Bozeman that I've read a lot, owner-occupied means if you're going to rent your house or a portion attached to it, the owner has to live somewhere on the property. They don't have to own all of them. And ADUs would be good for having a nanny, for having an in-home health care worker, for having your kids when they're teenagers and you don't want them in the house, for having your extra work spouse because your kids are so noisy that when you work, you need to go shut the door somewhere and be able to work silently. So those can be rented. If you start getting where the owner doesn't have to be there, then what happens is investors from out of state come and buy those, and then they jack up rents, and especially if it's short-term rentals. Bozeman's having a lot of that, and they're considering requiring owner-occupied and that leases be 30 days or more and not allowing the short-term rentals. Again, I said if you haven't seen the, it's called Passive House. There's a guy, Undecided, with Matt. It's pretty cool. I don't know how real it is. It's just something he talked about. We found it online when we were looking at things. I think anytime we can simplify the permits, it would be good. I know Bozeman, Montana has Montana State University integrated with it's about a third of the town. And what they did is they had the architecture people from MSU who actually did mock-up designs. They built little stick models that they have in their city hall. They have pre-approved designs, so if you want to do an ADU, you literally can walk in and get something that would move forward. But even so, they're not getting a lot of uptake because the cost per square foot for an ADU is so high that a lot of people aren't building them. And it does take time to do, and you can get more square footage out of other things. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is the first thing you talked about, is transfer of development rights. Transfer of development rights are severely needed. If you read the Critical Areas Handbook, you're supposed to have regulatory and non-regulatory. The non-regulatory program recommended is TDRs, which is transfer of development rights. Somebody can own property, sell the development right, and then still own that property, uses trails or parks or extra space. It still has an economic viability in addition to selling the transfer development right. When the city first did the TDRs outside, King County said, hey, you kind of have this emerald necklace thing, and if you have to do 20 and use them in town center, but then after that you can buy up to 75 of them. The city makes money on them, and what that means is the areas around Sammamish, they're not going to develop outside and then come use all of our facilities inside. So it's a good thing that happened, and I think the public that is talking negatively doesn't understand that. So the outside TDRs coming in are good. In city's good. The problem, the code right now only allows a road erosion areas to be transferred, not landslide. In Tamarack, where I live, is landslide. It should be any critical area. And anytime you've got critical areas, you don't want to have things like a minimum density, like where I live is R4, but we have some places that really shouldn't be building. And when those places transfer, so Tamarack has 40 vacant lots in it still, because it was platted in 1964. It's built out at about 80% development from 212 lots. Inglewood had, I can't even tell you how many, a lot of them have been aggregated. I believe Inglewood still has 167 lots that are vacant. So if you just add 40 and 160, you get 200 lots. So if you're talking about the numbers that Kelly was talking about for Town Center, you've got 200 lots that could just take up Inglewood and Tamarack areas. So please do TDRs. I did them as a docket. They need to go forward in any way they can. They will help the city. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the numbers from City Council meeting from last meeting. And if I were in your shoes, I'd want to know what it is I'm planning for. So I'm looking at a total of 2,100, but I see that 390 units are emergency transitional residential units. So I'd want to know what that is and continually get an update on those. And, you know, is it going to be 2,500 or 2,100? And then I see 554 units of permanent supportive residential units. I'd also want to know what that means. You know, do these have to be located in a certain area? What kind of support are these residents going to need? Because I think that's going to influence the tools that we're planning for. And maybe that hasn't come out of the wash yet, but I'd want a continual update of those numbers and the breakdown. And then as far as all these different tools, I mean, they're all tools in the toolbox, and I think you'll want a mix of them all. And I'm going to quickly look back. I know I warned us about looking back, so we can look forward. I think we spent probably the last 15 years of our resources and time on Town Center, which is 2,000 units, and we have 2.5 years for at least 2,500 units, but really we want good tools in case all the state stuff that's in these House bills may, you know, roll out, and then it could be way more than that. Oh, and that's just the regional needs. And then we have the internal needs. So, I mean, it's much higher than 2,500. So I don't like that level of effort indicator on the screen, but it's a reality. I mean, staff is limited and you guys are limited. And I don't know if there's a way to come out with a committee where people that have more time can get down and look at this. I look at you guys up here and I think, man, these people are bright. They know their stuff. But I think it's a shame maybe that you're behind the dais right now. Like, I would really like to see some tables set up and a study session and calculators out and IMAP up and measure an acreage, and Mark's got all his historical building costs of what it's going to cost the developer to do that, and, you know, what the rent category is, and, you know, just kind of run the numbers. And then, you know, Aaron's on there saying, well, if we give them a property tax credit, the law allows you to do this or this or this, and just kind of go through each one of these examples and come and do some dry runs. I know when I buy my medical insurance, like, I have no clue what I'm getting, but then I read the examples. Well, if this person has a baby and they do this, and this person goes to the hospital, breaks his arm, physical therapy, and do this, it's like, oh, okay. It becomes very real. And I think once we can sit down and go through all these, I think it's just going to open your mind to, like, all, you know, other scenarios and kind of enlighten us. And I wish there was like a true and tried method or a book we could read and just figure it out. But I think the people that are on your planning commission, you guys are the right people for the job. It's just the time and the effort. And, you know, I was just doing that in my head for ADUs, and I'm thinking, well, you know, and some of this may or may not be true, but it's like, okay, well, there's traffic inherency, and just to even start with that, I got to get on a list so they can run a batch test, and that's like 5,000 or 11,000, just to see if they're going to issue me a certificate. And then you know, I got a sewer connection. Really, it should just be digging a hole in the ground and connecting to a line, but, you know, it's much more money than that. Almost, I've heard it's absurd. Same with water, and then you have stormwater, and it's like, okay, well, now I got to run a drainage test and a downstream analysis and this and that, and it's like, okay, if I'm adding 200 square feet, could we just equate that to a couple rain barrels with a 1/8 inch hole or whatever it is to match pre-development state as a standard? Or, I mean, there's so much that we could do to simplify. Same thing on impact fees. I think committees would be awesome, but also roundtables with the building community. I mean, we've had them before. They don't hold back. They're going to tell you exactly what all the obstacles are for all this stuff. I agree with the home ownership comments. I really, I mean, there's benefits to it, and you know, condo laws prevent that, but maybe getting some townhomes and duplexes would be great. I just really think we need to get a list of all the different barriers as we go through maybe these design charades, almost like a, you know, a round table to get lists of all the barriers. For the tiny homes, I think the design standards are super important. I see seasonal housing as a big deal. I mean, if I had a tiny house, I'd be down in Arizona 6 months, and I'd be up here, you know, in the summers. I might take the mountains, and that may interchange well with like a teacher. I don't know if they're in the 0 to 30 or 30 to 50 or 80 or whatever, but they may be from Iowa, and they may want to live in their tiny house from September till June or July, and all of a sudden, you know, summer's open, and somebody may be backfilling that, you know, who doesn't want to spend summer here. But, you know, I would want to know if, you know, mobile home parks, they're their new rage. They're back in. There's people that are buying these RVs. They want to be mobile. I'd want to know how this AMI is split. I mean, if I rent out my mobile home spot as a park owner for $1,000, like, what is left of that AMI number to go to, you know, buying an RV or whatever? You know, somehow that's all going to have to be determined and split. And just the enlightening comment, I actually had an enlightening thought over there, and I'm just going to bring it up. But I have a neighbor that, you know, he's got a big old house on a big old lot, and he's probably got 10 cars there, and, you know, each room is rented out individually. Like, is that a housing option? I mean, we have all these McMansions. We talked about it before. Can we give the dude with a big house like a property tax break, and he rents out the room? Are we allowed to count that? And maybe there's already a lot of that happening in the town, but everyone's doing it undercover because they don't want to get busted by code. So all of a sudden, we pass this, and shoot, we might have 1,000 of that AMI knocked out immediately because, you know, there's already rooms being rented out. So I'd want to know, does that count? I mean, 8, 9 people living in a house sharing it. It may be an option if it's next to the R1 we talked about, next to grocery stores and services and transit. I mean, that might be okay if there's parking and stuff. So anyways, you guys are doing great. Thanks.
For the record, that last commenter was James Eastman of Sammamish. Okay, do we have another one?
Yes, we have one hand raised. Mr. Stickney, I'm going to promote you to panelist.
Howdy, Planning Commissioners. Lots of good conversations, topics. Enjoyed Mary's and James' comments also. Off the bat, a couple of shotgun comments. A homeowner association in a condominium of 2 units is a disaster. Make sure if you allow condos, they are at least 3, okay? Because if they don't get along, it just does not work. Condo laws are likely to change in the next few years. It's not a guarantee, but I know a lot of people in commerce and some consultants that are working for things, and it's coming. I don't know how soon. I also agree that owner occupied as much as, you know, possible and reasonable rental, yes, but owner occupied is good. Mercer Island and Renton have had ADUs a long time. I'm sure other cities are. Would be interesting to get the number of actual units created over the last 20 to 30 years in nearby Pierce City to get a little bit of guidance of what may be achievable. Carrie Bosworth comments on where ADUs go, I agree with. Josh Amato, good comments on appropriate design character when smaller. I think that's something the community really wants. Other commissioners, very good comments tonight on these topics. On ADUs, some issues to factor in are stormwater, impervious surface, and tree retention, climate change, transportation. Keep in mind, in our 2003 comp plan, the city identified housing gaps of 100% and under AMI at roughly 900 units and had factored in about internal needs of 2,100 back in 2003. A question, and I say this seriously, not angry, serious. Why was no inclusionary zoning in our community included on the 3,000 single-family homes that have been built since 2006? We could have had 300 units if we had a 10% factor on the single-family homes. All right, there was a, this is my main point, which was in my written comment as well. Today there was discussion about the housing needs analysis, and two words were used. The housing needs analysis was data rich. I guess there are three things. And there was discussion or quantified numbers. Let's take a hard look at that topic. The types of growth that exist, that I'm not saying are all mandatory, but they're possible to plan for depending on community discretion and importance, as well as mandatory. There's 2 R's and 4 I's. The 2 R's are regional share of state growth handed down to counties and then into city categories and, cohorts. And the second thing is city share of regional 80% and under housing. Those two things are quantified in the housing needs analysis. They certainly are. What's not quantified are the 4 I's. The first I is 1/7 of our local households within our own community that make 80% and under AMI. Those numbers do not exist in the housing needs analysis, past, present, or future. The next I2, is 6/7 of our local households, making 80% and over AMI. That's over 19,000 households, 85%. There's no quantified numbers. What do people earn relative to what houses cost? It doesn't mean we have to meet all those needs, but there's a cycle of life going on. So we need to know where we're short so people can so we can consider supply increases or not based on our own internal needs. The third I is all, demographic needs. That's discussed in the housing needs analysis, and maybe I missed it, and if I did, apologize. I didn't see a single internal demographic need number quantified. And the last thing is on workforce housing. We know that there's roughly 4,000 jobs here. What we don't know is how many would want to stay. I've shared this before, and it's important. Eco Northwest did a study in Eugene, Oregon, on a similar type of community to Sammamish, and they identified that roughly half of the people that worked there wanted to stay. There were 2 issues. 1, how large of a house they could buy, and 2, how long they were going to stay in their job. So it would be good for us to find out what percentage of those needs to be done. So my suggestion, and it won't be popular, is to pause all this and get that data, even if it takes a few months. We're driving a big housing truck that's filled with all this data. It's quantified for the region. It's unquantified for our community. We should get the quantified data, then compare over 40 consequences on which direction we go. There are 3 known, there could be other. Our comp plan had a certain a direction for 17 years. The next 5 years tried to achieve a much lower direction on all types of housing. I and several others have been saying, hey, hold on a minute, based on internal needs, we need to not eliminate, but limit large single family and to increase different diverse and smaller housing based on all those quantified numbers. Then discuss consequences across the board because they're radically different. Take a look at that sheet I sent. There are 40 topics, all those real, and all the outcomes are very different whether you go with current comp plan or very low growth or optimal growth. The solution is to get this right. We got to have our big housing truck that's going down a steep downhill slope stop on one of these runway ramps, come to a stop, unpack it, get all the data, decide what gets back in, and get to a community position that we agree on what our future looks like in centers and in neighborhoods, regional and internal. And that's my comment tonight. Appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Stickney, and we have no more hands raised.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. Anything else from staff this evening?
Yes, thank you very much for your time tonight and all your feedback. That was a heavy lift, but we got some really great information, and we're excited to bring back these strategies in the draft housing action plan for your review. So again, thank you and for your patience. Oh, and yes, Mark, we do have some certificates for Josh and TC, and we wanted to thank them for their service on the Planning Commission. It has been an honor to work with both of you, and we're really going to miss you. So, thank you.
Thank you for that.
Really enjoyed working with all of you who have worked. You staff work exceptionally hard, and it doesn't go unnoticed, even though sometimes my tone of voice might not make that clear. And I want you to know I appreciate that, and everyone up here on the dais and who previously had to deal with my questions and long-windedness. Thank you.
I'd also like to just say thanks to both of you. Both of you, just to be clear, both of them, their terms on the Planning Commission are coming to an end with this meeting this evening, so they're stepping off. I want to say thanks to TC. I really appreciated. Oftentimes he has a different perspective and asks some unique questions, and really that's a super valuable thing in a public forum to have different points of view. I really have appreciated working with TC, and I've gotten to know Josh fairly well. And I will say one of the things that is great for someone as a chair is to know that if I'm not going to be here for some reason, there's somebody that can step in and probably do a better job and show you up. And so Josh has always been there as vice chair to do that, and also contributes. He's always well prepared and contributes more than I ever would. So I want to really say that I will miss having both of you on the commission a great deal, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to serve with both of you. Thank you for your service to the community.
Thank you so much.
Anything else? All right, would someone move to adjourn, please?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.